This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
David Mackay says, "You're not James. Where's James?" There's no flies on you, David. I'll say that. And indeed to the rest of you as well. Do not adjust your radios. It is not Sunday with Lewis Goodall sitting in here for the great man, James O'Brien, from Monday to Friday this week. And what on earth are we going to talk about? Well, don't worry, everybody, because it's just the collapse of the post-war American-led order as we've known it. And we're only 2 weeks today, yes, hold on to your hats, 2 weeks today is the second fortnight anniversary of this second Trump presidency. Already it has felt like everything we might have expected it to have been and more. But probably I did not necessarily anticipate, I don't know about any of you, did not necessarily anticipate that of all of the many different enemies and geopolitical foes that Donald Trump could have sought to try and alienate, to seek to try and show how powerful he is, that he would decide to focus on the geopolitical equivalent of Ned Flanders, which is Canada. Got the Canadian ambassador coming on a bit later in the show, hoping that she hasn't taken offence at that. But it is true that you could not imagine a more sanguine, a more generous, a more reliable neighbour, a more congenial ally for the United States than Canada. It has been one of the defining features of American political history, that it has been blessed to have to its north a benign neighbour who in many respects simply just wanted to be left alone and was happy to be part of the wider political, economic, cultural North American hegemony so long as it could preserve its independence. And yet, what did we see this weekend? After only 2 weeks of the Trump presidency restored, we saw sporting events throughout the United States, including fans of the Toronto Raptors booing the US national anthem before a basketball game with the Los Angeles Clippers yesterday. Listen to this. That, of course, follows Donald Trump's decision to say that they has imposed 25% tariffs on Canada, on Mexico, on a whole range of different products. And here's the thing. It is not entirely clear why. Trump comes up with these pretty nebulous, pretty odd sort of list of reasons as to why he's annoyed with the Canadians. Part of it is around the trade deficit. He talks about being annoyed that America is being ripped off. Donald Trump is a constellation of political views, but if he's had one reasonably consistent thread throughout the long time he's been in American national life, it has been this sense, and it's hard to kind of define it and hard to put your finger on it exactly, but it's been this kind of sense that America is getting ripped off in some way. It's quite a mercantilist kind of view that somehow America isn't using its full economic and trade might and power as it might to achieve its ends and to get what it wants, and too many countries are selling to it as opposed to what they want to sell to them. So that's reasonably consistent. But then on the other hand, it's nonsense, right? It's nonsense because Canada and Mexico are also massive export destinations for the United States itself. And of course, what is Canada and Mexico doing? Well, they've announced overnight exactly what always happens in a trade war. They've announced retaliatory measures. In Canada, the Department for Finance has published a list of US products imported into Canada, saying it would target with a 25% retaliatory tariff starting tomorrow. That's going to amount to about 30 billion Canadian dollars worth of goods, which includes tobacco, produce, household appliances, firearms, military gear, all sorts of different things. And that's not to mention, of course, America, which is itself a manufacturing powerhouse, massively reliant on all sorts of Canadian raw materials, whether it's lumber or minerals or whatever it happens to be. So what is a tariff? This is what's the craziest thing of all. What is a tariff? Because Trump says it's his favourite word. He actually says it's his fourth favourite word after religion, God and love. But the fourth, he says, is tariffs. But what is a tariff? A tariff is just a tax. And actually, it's not a tax paid by the country that you're levying the tax on or the tariff on. It's paid by you. It's paid by you because the businesses will just pass it on to the consumers. And this is at precisely the time that Trump was elected, precisely to bring down costs. So we are staring down the barrel, as I say, not 2 weeks in to the second Trump presidency. We're staring down the barrel of a trade war across North America, which looks like it is going to spread to Europe as well. Trump was asked yesterday, he was on Air Force One, and he was asked whether he intended to extend those tariffs to Europe, including the UK. This is him speaking to reporters at Joint Base Andrews yesterday. This is what he had to say.
Well, we're going to see what happens. It'll happen, but we'll see how things work out. It might happen with them, but it will definitely happen with the European Union. I can tell you that, because they've really taken advantage of us. And, we have over a $300 billion deficit. They don't take our cars. They don't take our farm products. They take almost nothing. And we take everything from them. Millions of cars, tremendous amounts of food and farm products. So the UK is way out of line, and we'll see the UK, but European Union is really out of line. UK is out of line, but I'm sure I think that one can be worked out. But the European Union it's an atrocity, what they've done.
Prime Minister Starmer wants a closer relationship with the EU.
Well, Prime Minister Starmer has been very nice. We've had a couple of meetings. We've had numerous phone calls. We're getting along very well. And we'll see whether or not we can balance out our budget. With the European Union, it's $350 billion deficit. So obviously something's going to take place there.
So there's Donald Trump speaking to reporters about what he intends to do, extending these tariffs to Europe and potentially to the UK as well. And in the second hour of the show, I want to focus specifically on how the UK should respond to this potential world trade war and the imposition of these tariffs, and where we should sit, whether we should get closer to the EU. The Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, of course, off to Brussels today, attending the first European Council meeting for a British Prime Minister since Brexit, trying to straddle extremely awkwardly these two regulatory and geopolitical poles of the US and Europe. But I want to focus even bigger, or look even bigger, in the first hour of the show. And ask this question, and talk to you about this question. Trump has decided to spend, as I say, these first 2 weeks not attacking Russia, not doing as he said he would do, which was end the Ukrainian war within a single day. He's decided, yes, he's attached and imposed tariffs on China, but his ire, by comparison to his first term, not reserved for China, but instead his allies. He's instead decided to use his position, the bully pulpit of the American presidency, to attack his closest friends. Canada, Mexico, Panama, Colombia, the European Union, Denmark, suggesting at one point, and as far as I know, this is still the case, suggesting that he would use economic, cultural, and indeed even military power to obtain what he wanted in Greenland, which is Danish sovereign territory. This has scrambled the Western alliance. It's been worse even than NATO leaders and European leaders thought that it would. And the question that I want to discuss and put to you during this first hour of the show is whether American political leadership as we've known it is over. I am old enough to remember just a few short weeks and months ago when we were told, weren't we? We were told by Trump's allies and his advocates that he would strengthen the NATO alliance, that he would strengthen the Western alliance, that Biden had been nothing but torpor, that he had been weak, that he had been declinist, and that Trump, with that energy, that vigor, that verve, that vim, would come in and reinvigorate those alliances, show the strength that we need. Well, where are we? Where are we 2 weeks in? We've got Canadians who are, as I say, America's closest allies, both in geographical terms, but also culturally, politically, and economically. You could not find a country around the world which is closer in the American political orbit than Canada. And where are we? Well, we've got Canadians, ordinary Canadians, booing the US national anthem. so incensed are ordinary Canadian citizens that they and their government are being bullied. I mean, for goodness sake, Trump's done Justin Trudeau and the Canadian Liberal Party a massive favour. They were absolutely tanking in the polls until the last couple of weeks. Trump actually goes for them. Hey, presto, Trudeau's more popular, even though he's on the way out, and suddenly the Canadian Liberal Party are doing quite well in the polls. But that is because, inevitably, if you've got Trump going around saying, oh, right, you should become the 51st state, how do you expect people to react? Canadians fiercely, fiercely jealous of their own sovereignty, just as Americans are. And this is the point. And this is the thing that I think should worry us, and the thing that I think that British political leaders who still have their head in the sand on this one, as do a lot of European political leaders as well, although to a lesser extent, I think they do not understand the extent to which Donald Trump is reinvigorated by his second election win and is different to the first Donald Trump we saw. The first Donald Trump we saw from 2017 to 2021 was essentially isolationist. He was actually in some ways quite uninterested in world affairs. This is a very different Donald Trump now. He is expansionist. And the big difference, although there is continuity in different regards between Trump and actually Biden and Obama, if you go back to the Obama period, he was looking away from Europe as well, tilting towards China and the Pacific and all these sort of things. There is sometimes more continuity between American presidents than there is difference. But the big difference, it seems to me, between Trump and others is that Trump is the first American president since the Second World War, and I would even include George W. Bush in this, who is completely uninterested and unattached to any sense of what American power is for in the world, other than one simple truth and axiom in his own mind, and that is, might is right. If I'm able to do it, I should do it, I can do it, I will do it. I want Greenland, or I want particular ends in Greenland, I'll do it. International law, screw it. International institutions, screw it. Multilateral agreements, screw it. Let's not forget that Trump imposing these tariffs is literally ripping up an agreement he himself signed with Canada and Mexico back in his first presidency. So we can't trust this guy. He reneges even on his own agreements, and that is because, as I say, he thinks that might is right. If I can do it, I will do it. And that is just of a qualitatively different approach to every American president of the post-war order, even including George W. Bush, who was in many ways a fierce nationalist and did not much care for many of these international institutions. Trump is either unaware of or does not care to know of the post-war security architecture, the order which kept Europe and kept the world at peace since the end of the Second World War. In that respect, he is far more like Vladimir Putin. He is far more like President Xi. And the real worry for me, let's leave aside the tariffs, which, can come and they can go, and a lot of economies might be able to absorb them. The real worry for me is that what Trump is doing is that he's basically saying to someone like Xi over Taiwan, or saying to Putin over Ukraine, or who knows, the Baltic states or wherever, if you've got the power to do it, do it. Just do it. It doesn't matter, because nothing matters other than your own power. And that is the big difference, it seems to me, between what we've had before, even including the first Trump presidency, by the way, and what we have now. Because the people around him all think that. They all think that the only thing that matters is American power. And also, he wants a legacy. He wants a legacy. So don't be surprised if there is some crisis over whether it's Greenland or Panama or something else, because he wants something to point to. He is a real estate developer. He's a real estate developer. If he sees something, he thinks he should be able to buy it, or he should be able to secure it, or he should be able to obtain it. And it seems to me that Keir Starmer and others, I keep hearing this from UK ministers, he's a deal maker. He's look at what he says and look at what he does, not what he says. Well, look at both is what I would say. I want to talk to you about what you think we should do, not just the UK, but also whether American leadership in the world is now over. Or at the very least, it has taken, you agree with me, it has taken a fundamentally different shift. And if so, what we should do to handle it, both in the UK and in Europe as well? Are we clinging to just fantasies? What should we do about it? Can we do anything about it? Does Europe have the power to do anything about it? And what does it mean for the world? What does it mean for the world if American leadership has fundamentally shifted, if it is different to what it used to be? 0345 6060 973. 0345 6060 973. Of course, you can text 82850. And remember as well, we're going to be talking to someone who's really at the sharp end of this after 10:30, which is a Canadian ambassador to the UK, getting a sense from them about how their government intends to handle this. Let's not forget, by the way, Canada, the King. Who's the head of state in Canada? It's the King. So we do have more than a passing interest in what goes on in the US-UK relationship and whether it could be the 51st state. Lewis Goodall sitting in for James O'Brien here on LBC. The time is 10:19.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 10:21. Just in terms of illustrating a little bit about what I mean about the collapse, or certainly let's put it in a less pejorative way, the shift, the mutation in American leadership. One way, which is the Trump administration is already having a dramatic impact around the world, is what Trump has decided to do on US aid. US international aid, US aid, one of the big programs of the federal government. Trump has decided to basically stop all US aid, apart from in a couple of areas. And indeed, just yesterday, guess who's in charge of that now? Or guess who's in charge of this program? Or at least whose oversight it falls into? Well, one, Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency. And indeed, just yesterday, the website of the US Agency for International Development went offline without any explanation, as thousands of furloughs, layoffs and program shutdowns continued in Trump's freeze on US-funded foreign aid and development worldwide. And that comes as aid agencies around the world are warning about starvation. They're warning about a cut-off of medical supplies. They're warning of really dramatic impacts in some of the world's most frightening places. Now, Trump has sort of changed it a little bit to try and keep some of that absolutely vital to life aid going. But nonetheless, there is complete confusion and bewilderment, just like there is across the federal government right now. I mean, that's the other point, is that Trump has brought in Musk and others, and their whole ethos, their whole philosophy, their whole rationale is like, let's just break as much stuff as we can. Let's break stuff, let's smash it up and let the pieces fall where they may. But that itself has implications for leadership and for American leadership. Because if the whole structure of the government itself is just like falling apart, then how can anyone lead anything? It's really difficult. And we've not seen, and you know who fills the vacuum? Well, it's countries like China. I guarantee you right now, in places like Panama, Colombia, all of these places where actually close American allies and those alliances are being strained, there is one country which is very eager to fill that gap, and it is China, who are always looking for allies and who don't chop and change policy every couple of minutes. So they want to spend the first hour of the show today. In fact, we're going to spend in one form or another the first couple of hours of the show today on this question about American leadership, but specifically want to talk to you in this hour about how you think American leadership is changing, and whether you think, I mean, should we lament it? Maybe you think actually it's a good thing. Maybe you don't. Maybe you're one of those people, the sort of Noam Chomskys of the world, who think that America has generally been a negative force in the world. So you welcome this change of approach. Or if you, like me, think that it augurs something very bad indeed. 0345 6060 973. Liz says, Trump has given Canada high tariffs deliberately to say, I can do it to my friends besides my enemies. I bet he'll reverse it with Canada sooner than expected. That is certainly possible, Liz. And Pauline says, I think we should all unite around Canada and do trade deals with them. As I say, Pauline, amazed we're not getting more solidarity from the British government with Canada. I'm going to talk about that in a little while. Let's talk to Alan, who is in Bury. Alan.
Morning, Lewis.
Good morning. Right, very well, thank you. Good. Yeah, what do you think about this?
I just think we are really in a dire position because we are now Billy No Mates. Because we're out of the EU, we've lost 15% of our trade, 4% of our GDP at least. It's costing us, thanks to the Conservatives, at least 40 billion a year. If the Americans jump all over us, then how many shocks can the UK economy take? And the thing is, if you know, historically, I mean, Canada, you know, they've been at our side in 2 world wars, Canada, and people forget that. They are almost our kith and kin.
I'm amazed, Alan. I've been saying this morning. I mean, I'm amazed that given everything that's going on and the sort of bullying, let's call a spade here. I mean, the absolute bullying that we're seeing from Trump with regards to Canada and the Canadian people. I mean, they're in the Commonwealth. It's a close ally of ours. The King is the head of state there. Heard nothing from the British government about it. No,
and the thing is, if Europe says, okay, we're in a position, right, let's go for more trade deals. I don't know if Europe has got a trade deal with Canada or Mexico.
It has got one with Canada, yeah.
But if Europe says, okay, we'll go for an alliance of countries not other than the US, we haven't got a negotiation team to do that, because we used to rely on the EU to do all our trade negotiations. And when we were negotiating, Brexit, Jean-Michel Barnier would go in with about 80 files, and David Davis, after he'd been to the bar, would go in with a sheet of A4. But it's, for me, Keir's got I'm a Labour man. Keir's got big decisions. You cannot rely on negotiating with someone as unreliable, unpredictable as Trump, and basically is a con man, a convicted felon, and the nutcases, the misfits he's got around him. We have to pull closer to Europe.
Do you think, Alan? Do you think that there is anything left of American leadership in the world right now?
No, I think we've gone back to the 1930s. But I think the difference this time, Lewis, is you haven't got an FDR. You haven't got anyone. They are.
This time, America is the source of instability. I'm not saying that it's like Nazi Germany, but it's certainly the source of one of the sources of instability in the world right now.
Yeah, and the other is obviously Russia and China. We've been, I mean, what people fail to remember, Lewis, is Russia has ordered 2 chemical attacks on these shores.
Yep.
One when Alexander Litvinenko, and the other Salisbury poisoning. And they think they can do what they want and get away. And Europe needs to pull together. We have to support Ukraine no matter what. And we have to try and wreck the Russian economy.
See, Alan, I think it's not. I know what you mean about the 1930s. I actually think, in a weird sort of way, it's a bit more like the 1910s or the pre-First World War period, where you've got basically kind of big, great powers. In this case, we've got United States, Russia, China, maybe the EU alongside. You've got these big, great powers, essentially making up the rules as they go along, and in a vaguely globalized world, still acting in quite an imperial, quasi-colonial way, basically deciding to do what they can to maximize their own power outside a set of agreed rules and norms, which is what we saw. Obviously, it wasn't perfect and it didn't always work out that way, but at least there was an attempt to impose an order after the Second World War. That is collapsing. It feels like to me we're going back to something more like we saw in the 19th or early 20th centuries.
Yeah, I mean, you have the obviously the United Nations after, and then you have the iron and steel community in Europe, and that evolved eventually into the EU, because the people, the wise old heads of the EU says, "Hang on, we've been killing each other for 1,000 years. Why not start trading? It's a lot better." And it was the greatest vehicle for peace ever. It made us all richer, and for me personally, the Tories should be damned for what they've done. Cameron to Osborne, this Brexit deal was made in Eton.
All right,
they have wrecked it.
Alan, grateful to you. Laura has WhatsApped in saying, I moved to Canada from the UK 6 years ago. It can't be stated how quickly and completely the entire country has galvanised against these tariffs. The LCBO, the Liquor Control Board of Ontario, I didn't think I'd be saying that today, Laura, I have to say, but thanks very much for that, is one of the largest buyers of alcohol in the world. And starting tomorrow, all US products are being pulled from the shelves. There's a big grassroots movement too, promoting Baba, buy anything but American. It doesn't matter what happens in 4 years' time. No one will trust the US as a trading partner for decades to come. And this is the problem. This is the problem, right, with when you poison these relationships. These things, it's like any reputation, isn't it? It's like any reputation. The old truism about it. It can take years and years to build up, and it can take a second to just disappear. Could happen to me on this show throughout the next 2.5 hours, who knows? But it is easily done that these things can be squandered away. And it is very difficult, potentially even with a change in presidency. And what amazes me, and we'll talk about this in the second hour of the show a bit more, what amazes me is the kind of complacency that we've had in Britain and Europe about America over the last few years. And don't be wrong, this does not for me, this does not come from a place of being anti-American. I love America. I spent loads of time reporting there. I love its politics. I love its people. I love its culture. I think you won't all agree with this, but I think America, generally speaking, has been a force for liberty and for good throughout the world. And so it pains me to see what is becoming of it in terms of its reputation, of it abandoning its best ideals and being that empire of liberty, as it used to sort of refer to itself, and instead returns to its darker instincts. We're going to be talking to Ralph Goodale, who's Canada's High Commissioner to the UK, a little bit later on, just after the news, because obviously they are at the centre of all of this, and we might need their advice, because we might find ourselves at the centre of it quite shortly as well. First, though, that's 10:31. Let's get the news headlines with Thomas Watts.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Time is 10:34. Nathan has WhatsApped in on this question of American leadership, saying, Lewis, it won't take decades to repair relationships. Trump is a one-off. Yes, a bad one, but he will be gone in 4 years. The world knows that, but sadly has to deal with him, limit the damage he may do, bide its time. Well, Nathan, I suppose there are a few rejoinders to that. One is, well, we're only 2 weeks in, so we still have 3 years and 10 months, or sorry, 3 years, I'm getting ahead of myself, 3 years and 11 months and 2 weeks of the Trump presidency to go. So given what he's done in 2 weeks, imagine where we might be by January 2029. Gosh, my 40th birthday year, that's a sobering thought. January 2029, and see where the world might be then. But also, I'm not so convinced by what you say in terms of Trump being a one-off. Trump has already transformed the politics of the Republican Party. That he ensured that by winning 3 presidential nominations for Republicans, and he's done it by winning a second presidency. And I think that whoever becomes the next nominee is far more likely to be in Trump's image. Certainly in policy terms, probably no one can really emulate his particular style, which is sort of electric, whatever you think about it politically. Whatever happens, I think the Republican Party has been shifted. It is not going to be the party of Ronald Reagan or even George W. Bush. It is not going to return to these free trading axioms and that kind of free market kind of approach. It is going to stay more protectionist, which is a rich seam in American politics, and more isolationist as well. Someone and a country that is going to have to deal with that, of course, is Canada. And I'm delighted to say we're joined now by Ralph Goodale, who's Canada's High Commissioner to the UK. High Commissioner, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Obviously, this is a pretty turbulent time for Canada. Canada's announced retaliation in terms of its tariffs. This is all being done more in sorrow than in anger, I take it.
Yes, most definitely. We are a neighbor, a friend, an ally, in many cases, a family member with the United States. So this predicament is very sad in terms of North American relationships. That doesn't make us any less determined. Canadians have been more unified on this issue in the last 72 hours than I've seen them in a very long time. There's a deep disappointment. There's a kind of bubbling anger there about the way Canada has been treated, but we are calm and focused, sticking to the facts, because the facts are very much in our favor, and absolutely resolute in how we approach this situation. And Canadians are responding from coast to coast to coast with that same message. It crosses political differences. It crosses geographic and sectoral differences. It crosses economic differences. There's a great unity among Canadians that we've got to stand together now like we've never stood before.
High Commissioner, what would you say to President Trump's justification and accusation for the reason he says he's levying and imposing these tariffs? He says the reason he's doing it is because, for 2 reasons. He is concerned that the border between Canada and the US is not being adequately policed on 2 fronts. One, in terms of migration, but also in terms of fentanyl. And therefore, he's doing it as a punishment for that. What is your response to that?
Well, as you know, the rationale changes from day to day and from time to time, and from news conference to news conference. The border between Canada and the United States is a very precious thing. It is the longest, most secure unmilitarized, most profitable international boundary in the world. There are 400,000 people that go back and forth across that boundary every day. There's $3 or $3.5 billion in trade and in goods and services, quite literally every single day. When you track the movement of either illegal goods or illegal people moving back and forth in that huge flow, in terms of the amount of that problem in the United States that originates in Canada, it's about 1%. And this, both in terms of the migration of people and the movement of fentanyl. In fact, the U.S. has a serious problem with fentanyl, as we do in Canada. But we're dealing with our problem domestically, and the movement across the border is a tiny factor. In fact, the greater problem is the movement of illegal drugs and illegal guns from the United States into Canada. That is serious, and we would appreciate American cooperation in stopping that flow, just as we're prepared to work with them every day in stopping any flow of illegal people or goods moving the other way. It's a tiny problem in relative terms, but it's a problem that must be addressed, and we're certainly prepared to do it. I think the reference to this in the legal documentation is simply a hook upon which to hang the legal basis for the action, which is under U.S. emergency legislation.
Yeah,
and therefore they have to describe it as an emergency, which is the legal justification, but the facts just don't support it.
Leaving the tariffs to one side, High Commissioner, although it's sort of part of the same thing, can I take it from what we saw over the weekend with, Canadians booing the US national anthem and so on, can I take it that in terms of the tenor and tone of Trump's rhetoric, suggesting, calling your Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, Governor Trudeau, suggesting that you should become the 51st state, I can take it from this, deduce from this, that Canadians universally, as you say, pretty universally, have found this all highly offensive?
I think that's very true. Very disappointing, because this is not what we would expect from our closest neighbor, friend, and ally. But it has provoked an anger among Canadians that I've never seen before. Now we'll see the ebb and flow of international relations and politics, how this unfolds into the future. But at the moment, Canadians are deeply, deeply offended and are determined to stand their ground and fight back. And I guess if we had a message to deliver to our other friends and allies in the world, of which there are many, we would say to, for example, the UK or to the EU, don't be complacent. Canada is sort of the canary in the coal mine. This will not be the first or the last attack on, maybe the first, but it won't be the last attack on sovereignty. And you could be next.
The British government clearly is hoping and believes that it might be able to avoid tariffs and strike a deal with Trump. I've interviewed, and I'm sure you speak to all the time, interviewed lots of UK government ministers who say, let's judge him by his deeds, not by his words. Do you think that you can make a deal with this particular with President Trump at this stage of his political life and in this particular point of his presidency? Or do you think that idea from the British government is just too optimistic?
Well, I think they have to try. The extent to which you could rely upon an agreement struck now, and how long will it last? After all, the trading arrangement that Mr. Trump is now criticizing between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico is an agreement that he himself negotiated the last time he was president. and you go back and read the announcements that were made at the time that the U.S. Mexico Canada agreement was signed 4 or 5 years ago. It's glowing rhetoric about how this is the most brilliant trade agreement ever negotiated, and now it's the worst thing that he's ever seen, and he's the author of it. So I would say to the UK or others, do your very best, because it's in your self-interest to see if you can find a way to insulate yourselves, but be wary, have your eyes wide open, and don't at all be complacent about who or what you're dealing with. This is a very dangerous time for the world, and it's a time when we, from Canada's point of view, would certainly wish the UK every success in that kind of attempt, that kind of negotiation, because maybe ultimately that can help all of us. But be wary.
Do you think that Trump is a danger to world stability?
Well, it's certainly what has happened in the last number of hours has certainly destabilized the world's economy. You look at the stock market on Friday, when there was speculation about what would happen over the weekend, and then the stock markets around the world today, as they begin to open, there's clearly an impact there, and that destabilizes the world in a very serious way. So you've got to just look at the hard evidence.
High Commissioner, obviously Britain is not entirely indifferent in this situation, or is not entirely disinterested, I should say, in this situation, in the sense that, of course, not only does the UK and Canada share a long shared history, of course, but also we both share a head of state, and currently President Trump is suggesting that he should be head of state of Canada. Have you received much in the way of diplomatic support or solidarity from the British government during this period?
Well, it's a period that's been very brief so far, so there's hardly been an opportunity. It's not a topic that we've really had the chance to discuss, but we would certainly expect from a diplomatic and political point of view that the UK would be very supportive for a great many reasons, including the fact that we have the same head of state, and that's an important factor. The division in our system, yours and ours in Canada, the distinction between head of state and head of government, and as the events of January the 6th demonstrated 4 or 5 years ago, that distinction is very important.
Does this make the case for renewed cooperation, particularly with regards to trade, between countries like the US, between the countries like the UK and Canada? Obviously, we do have a bare bones trade agreement, or it was a sort of equivalent to that we had with the EU, with a few added bits as well. But should we perhaps be looking at a new trade deal between the UK and Canada? Is that something that Canada would be interested in?
In fact, we're doing that right now. The trade continuity agreement that was implemented quickly between us in the wake of Brexit. This was in the spring of 2021. That agreement gives each of us free market access to each other's markets for trade in goods and services that is 99% tariff-free and 99% quota-free. So that's pretty good. We need to work on that last 1%.
Do you think there's a case to accelerate that process at the moment, given everything we're seeing?
I think there is. The trade negotiators have been meeting off and on since 2021 to conduct that negotiation. There's another consultation that will be taking place in a month or so. There may well be renewed enthusiasm about this prospect in the wake of what has happened over this weekend.
Finally, High Commissioner, do you think that we in the West, in Europe, Canada, take the US away, do you think we can still rely on American Western leadership?
Oh, I would not leap to the conclusion that that damage of that kind has yet been done.
Really?
I think we need to work through this situation very carefully to ensure that we try to get to the best possible result in the fastest possible way among people who have been friends and allies and partners in a very intimate way for a very long time. You don't throw that away easily. But I think we need to be alert to the difficulties that are now on the table, and we shouldn't be naive about the relationships that we have among us. We need to work hard at them and don't take them for granted.
Ralph Goodale there, Canada's High Commissioner to the UK. Canada, of course, a country which is finding itself at the centre of the maelstrom that is Trump 2, Return of the Trump, the sequel that, well, a lot of people wanted, clearly, because he won a lot of votes in the US election. I wonder if quite so many voters anticipated that the man who stood on the ticket and platform of getting costs down would, by his own hand, increase those costs by a factor in some cases of 25%, perhaps more. Something that, as I say, is going to hit the pocket of the American consumer. A tariff is a tax on an individual, as much as, if not more than, it is on the state to which it is applied. I want to talk to you and hear from you now about whether you think the era of American leadership in the world in the West is over. 0345 60 60973, 0345 60 60973. Lewis Goodall sitting here on LBC for James O'Brien. The time is 10:51.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Time is 10:53. Very struck by what the Canadian High Commissioner had to say there. He's a diplomat, of course, usually diplomatic, and he was still measured. Of course he was. But very, very striking, saying that the UK and Europe had to prepare ourselves and should prepare ourselves for being next. That it is difficult to make a deal with this man, that he's unpredictable, making that point that I make again, and I'm going to be talking about a little bit after 11 o'clock. How difficult it is to secure a deal because he'll renege on it if he so chooses, which is exactly what he's done with Canada and Mexico, a deal that wasn't signed by Joe Biden, wasn't signed by Barack Obama, wasn't signed by anybody but himself in Trump 1. Trump 2 comes along 2 weeks in, rips it up. Let's talk to John in Wakefield, who's got something to say about this, I think. John.
Yeah, hi.
Morning.
Good morning.
Your thoughts on American leadership, John?
Well, when Trump said he wants to be a dictator, and we all kind of went, yeah, it's just Trump being Trump, I think it's about time a lot of people started actually paying attention to what he's saying.
Yeah.
Because like all dictators in the past, they create a problem that doesn't exist so that they can go and fix it, or apparently fix it, so they can say to their people, their followers, look what I've just done. And so I'm thinking that these tariffs, I don't understand, for example, with Canada in particular, what he actually hopes to achieve by it, because he's just upsetting all his friends and neighbours for what?
Shall I tell you what I think it is, John? I think he just likes wielding power. I think he enjoys the sense of being strong. Yeah. You know, he enjoys the sense. He's doing it not for any particular reason, but just because he can.
That's exactly what I was going with this point, because I heard the sort of Canadian ambassador to the US yesterday or this morning on YouTube, whatever it was, saying, look, they've done this and they've done that. They've gone to the Trump team and said, look, this is what we've done. What else do we need to do to stop this happening? And they're just not hearing back from the Trump team. So either the Trump team don't know what they're doing, or there's no answer to the question and they're just ignoring it completely. I just don't know. But it's kind of like, again, listen to Trump yesterday at whatever airport he was at, saying about the European Union going to get the tariffs next. And they were kind of saying, well, they're sending us all their goods, but they're not buying ours. Well, that's free trade. If
it's also just nonsense. It's also just nonsense. Buy loads and loads of them. John, grateful to you. Want to get Craig in before we go to the news, though. Craig, who's in Wiltshire. Craig.
Yes, hello.
Morning.
12-second biographical background.
Okay.
I am a white male American citizen married to a Brit. We met at the University of St. Andrews, and while I was courting her then, I have said the same mantra for 41 years of our marriage, and that is, Never underestimate the stupidity of the American people. We have known who Trump is for the past 20 years, the grifter, con man who inherited all his wealth, and the sycophants that surround him that cause rage in most of us every day doesn't bleed away because he's like a poison. So we could talk about sending a man to the moon and building excellent bridges, all done by immigrants. The fact is that the American people are too stupid and too brainwashed to disavow themselves from this grifter. Have I made my thoughts clear?
I think you're reasonably clear, Craig. I mean, I wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of you. If that's you being not clear, I wouldn't get on the wrong side of you when you are being clear, quite frankly. Craig, I mean, do you think that, I mean, the thing that is interesting, we're going to talk about this after 11 a little bit, is that do you think, as an American yourself, do you think that Americans, certainly not his base, I've spent enough time with his base to know that, you know, frankly, as he himself said, you know, he could go down Fifth Avenue, start shooting, he'd still be treated as a folk hero. But for your more average American who maybe voted for him for understandable reasons around costs, the economy, inflation, all of the rest of it, these tariffs are going to make that problem worse, not better. Does he pay a political price for that?
Well, again, if you accept my mantra, never underestimate the stupidity of the American people, then the answer is no. But you've nailed it on the head. All during the Biden 4-year program, the economy improved, but what was the lingering negative aspect to that? It was inflation. Now this bozo has come along, decided to whip out tariffs, enter into trade wars that is going to drive up inflation, the stock market's tanking. Hello? How stupid did the American people have to be to get this through their head?
Okay, well, I think the old 5G or the old Wiltshire reception is getting the best of us there. Apparently not the best. We need more phone towers in Devizes. That is what the Prime Minister wants to do. He wants to start building and not blocking. Hey, there you go. A little message there from Keir Starmer. And it is Keir Starmer, in a sense, to whom we are going to turn in the next hour of the show, because we're going to talk a little bit about, we're going to keep on this issue around Trump and American leadership, but turn to British leadership in the context of that collapse, or certainly dramatic mutation, change in American leadership. Where does it leave us? Little old Britain, little old Blighty, outside of the EU, in a world of massive regulatory great power blocks. The United States acting in this mercantilist way. China with the absolute technological superpower and still the regulatory superpower of the EU. Where does it leave Britain? Keir Starmer is off to Brussels today for the first EU Council meeting for a British Prime Minister since Brexit. But he is trying to sit in the middle of the road. Someone once said, you know what happens? You get stuck.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Time is 11:03. I can just see that the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, fresh from his meeting, of course, yesterday at Chequers with our own Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is saying that, of course, that the EU can react with its own tariffs. Should the US do as Trump has suggested, it's highly likely that he will, which is impose tariffs on the EU, suggesting that the EU is ripping them off, etc., etc. And this is, of course, what happens. This is what happens with tariffs. It is a cascade. One country applies them, and then another country applies them back, and so on and so forth. And before you know where you are, what do you have? You have a more expensive world. Because cost, which literally did not exist, it did not exist the day before, is suddenly levied. It is there, which makes the whole global marketplace less efficient. But also, it means that, on far less highfalutin terms, it hits you. It hits you where it hurts, in your pocket. Because suddenly, you've got businesses passing down that cost to you. Tariffs are just taxes. That's not to say that they're not important sometimes. You don't want to have necessarily a kind of Hobbesian state of nature, free-for-all thing where you just have complete free trade. Sometimes that can lead you to being ripped off. Trump is not totally wrong about China, for example, in the way that it is highly protectionist of its industries, that it dumps all sorts of products on the European and US marketplaces. Sometimes you do need tariffs to protect your own industries, to make sure that you have nascent growth. I mean, Biden was one of the most protectionist, economically protectionist presidents we've seen in recent years. Just as protectionist in many ways as Donald Trump was. More protectionist than he was in his first term. That's what I mean about there being more continuity sometimes between US presidents than meet the eye. But this blanket kind of just reactionary, just because I can, just because I'm bigger than you, just because I'm a bit more of a bully than you, because I want to flex my muscles, I want to get into a something measuring contest. Well, that is what we're seeing from the Trump administration. That is what is illogical. That is what is irrational. That is what leads you to trade wars. That is what leads you, dare I say it, to recession, particularly for the rest of the world. America, to some extent, might be able to withstand it because its economy is doing much better. Not so here, where our economy is barely growing at all, skidding along the bottom. And then suddenly you add shocks in like this before you know where we are. British business confidence already extremely volatile, already extremely shaky. Where is it going? Through the floor. And that's the question I want to sort of address and get to in this second hour of the show, is what we do about it. We've talked about American leadership. We've talked about the global thing. Where do we go? Do we still stick in the middle of the road? But if we do so, do we get run over? Do we get just smashed to bits? Because right now, the British government's position, it seems to me, outside of the EU, stuck. Remember when we were going to be that great trading nation back in 2016? And this is one of the other, I have to say, I don't want to sound like James O'Brien just because I'm in his seat. Oh my goodness gracious, it's like his ghost is around us everywhere. He's not dead, by the way, should make that absolutely clear. He was just away for a week. But he seems to be infecting my every move here. But would be right. I'm sure if he was sat in this chair, he would say one thing, which is to say that, of course, 2016, go back to Brexit. What was the rationale? What was the philosophy that was put forward? We were going to be a buccaneering trading nation. It was going to be an era of free trade. We were going to have freer trade outside of the EU than we would within it, because the EU is a protectionist bloc. Well, of course, we left just at the moment that the great post-war era of globalization, put on steroids in particular after the fall of the Berlin Wall, started to come to an end, where protectionism came back, partly, though not exclusively, as a result of the election of Trump in 2016. And so what has that meant? It's meant that the prospectus on which we voted with regards to Brexit has turned out to be illusory in all sorts of ways. The geopolitical environment in which we are operating is very different. It is now dominated not by a world of tariffs and regulatory barriers diminishing and shrinking and coming down, but instead dominated by different massive regulatory blocks, the US, China, the EU, putting more barriers, more tariffs, more barriers to trade. And where does that leave Little Britain? Floating somewhere in the North Atlantic with no one much caring about what we have to say. And that is the geopolitical reality, which is not of Keir Starmer's making, but of which Keir Starmer must try to do something. Who do we choose? Which side are we on? Right now, it feels like we're trying to be on every side. Right now, it feels as if we are hoping that if we don't say very much, if we just zip our lips, if we just try and avoid the gaze and the ire of Trump, and to even some extent of Brussels, that no one will much notice us. So much for global Britain, huh? But if we can just keep our heads down, we can avoid Trump's tariff. Now, that does not mean that we will be inured or immune to the effects of those tariffs, because we still import, if there are rising supply prices from all over the world, we are a very, very open economy. That inevitably affects us. If there's inflation caused as a result of this around the world, that inevitably affects us. If there's inflation, then that means there are interest rate rises across the world. That inevitably affects us. But in terms of the direct imposition from Trump, maybe we'll be able to get away with it. But at what cost? What do we have to do? How far do we have to bend? How long do we have to kiss the ring in order to be able to avoid the imposition of those tariffs? And crucially, as the High Commissioner himself was saying just now, even if we can come to an agreement with Trump, can we trust him to honour it? Because as I've been saying in the last hour of the show, that is exactly what he did with Canada and Mexico. He reneged. Little haiku there. Lovely to see. That is exactly the question around Trump that I asked Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, when she came into this very studio doing Sunday with Lewis Goodall, the imaginatively named Sunday show, yesterday, asking her whether we can trust Trump to honour any agreement that he might make with us. This is what she said.
Well, I think the right thing to do is for the UK government to be working not just with the US, but actually with countries across the world to try and reduce trade barriers for our businesses so that they can grow, so that they can strengthen across the world.
We would trust him.
But I think what we have to do is to work in Britain's interests. It's in Britain's interest to try and prevent trade barriers escalating. It's in Britain's interest to try and remove trade barriers with all countries across the world.
We would trust President Trump not to renege on any agreements that we would make with him. The British government trusts him.
Well, what Johnny Reynolds is doing is trying to work with the US government on how to reduce.
Do we trust him? Do we trust him to honour any agreement he would make with us?
We've got long-standing relationships with the US on a whole series of different areas.
But we would trust him to honour those agreements.
Well, we need to be able to work with governments, don't we?
Answer came there now. You will note that the Home Secretary, who was giving a very accomplished interview in lots of ways, she felt unable, really astonishing in many ways, that the Home Secretary, one of the most senior figures in the British government, felt unable to say that they could trust the American president to keep his word. I cannot think of any equivalent of that in the post-war era. Labour, Conservative, Republican, Democrat, whichever constellation, whichever configuration you might have, I cannot think of a moment where such a senior British government minister would feel unable to simply say, yes, Lewis, of course we can trust the American president. They're our closest ally. It just shows how far and how quickly geopolitics has shifted. But of course, had all of this been a bit different, had we still been in the EU, of course, in one sense, we would be being more negatively affected now because we would definitely be subject to the imposition of tariffs that Trump would be about to impose. But of course, there would be two key differences. One, we would be part of a big, powerful club, which we're not currently in. And secondly, we would be exerting influence and having control and power over what the EU itself does with its power, because we would be part of it. We would be both more powerful within, and the EU itself would be more powerful without, because it would have Britain's strength and muscle and economic might in there as well. As it is, we're a house divided in Europe. And we have to try, and Keir Starmer has to try and find a way to straddle, if that is what he chooses to do, try and find a way to straddle this geopolitical chasm over which he finds himself. And of course, there are different options. Option one, you decide to go all in with Trump. And you decide to basically do what we know does work with Trump, which is you basically kiss the ring for as long and as hard as possible. Sorry if you haven't eaten your breakfast already and you've spat out your fruit and fibre, but there we are. You try and do that for as long as possible. You get close to him and he likes you. And weirdly, if you are really obsequious, it might work, because if you're really obsequious to him, he does tend to be weirdly loyal to you. So that could work. But of course, at what cost? And you could certainly alienate your European allies, with whom, we must not forget, we do most still of our trade, or a plurality, strong plurality of our trade. Option two, you decided to cling close to Europe. You go, Trump is an unreliable partner, the EU is a rules-based organisation, it's a law-based organisation, we've got leaders there we can work with, let's go close to Europe. Maybe we do a customs union, who knows, single market, who knows? Obviously downsides with that, you definitely alienate Trump, difficult for security, difficult for various sort of things you want to do around the world. And of course, there may be internal domestic political problems as well, because Starmer is still terrified about messing around with the Brexit settlement, despite the fact we know the Brexit settlement is now pretty much universally disliked across the country, even among Leave voters. That's a problem. Option three, which seems to be the one that Starmer is electing to pursue. You just try and obviate the decision. You try and do a little bit of both. You try and duck and dive, a bit of this, a bit of that, keep your head down. You can see the appeal of that because it basically is the thing that is most aligned to UK foreign policy history down the ages. You do a bit of this, bit of that, US, and Europe. You try and be that bridge. Problem is with that is, as I say, you might end up in the middle of the road and then you get knocked down or stuck for some reason. I'm not entirely sure why I said that, but you might get stuck if you get run down. You get run down, as Nye Bevan once said. Sticking on the fence a little bit too long. And in the end, you basically end up in the worst of both worlds, disliked by all, trusted by none. That, it seems to me, is the geopolitical situation that we're in right now. I mean, whether you like it or not, remain, leave, that's in the past. That is where we are. And what I'd like to talk to you about, get your thoughts on, is which of those three options you would elect to go for. Option one, US. Option 2, EU. Option 3, bit of both. Or maybe there's an option 4. I haven't considered China. I don't know, maybe. Maybe there's an option 4 or an option 5. But where does Britain go now? How do we position ourselves? Where do we situate ourselves in this new world order? Because the old world order, which is Europe plus the United States, it is clear on lots of matters that is just not going to be available to us anymore. Trump and his circle intensely dislike the EU. They see it as the sort of organisational, supranational, international structure that is anathema to their politics. They like strong nation states operating with other strong nation states bilaterally. That is why they dislike the EU. So wherever they can, they will try and thwart it. Trump has said before he'd like to see it break up. He called himself Mr. Brexit. So that straddling, it feels to me, might not have a lot of road. And I know, because I've spoken to UK government ministers, some of them say and hope that Trump loses interest in this foreign policy stuff. They hope that his power diminishes. I'll just say this. It is entirely possible it's the other way around. Two-term US presidents tend to have a pattern. And okay, Trump often doesn't fit the pattern. But two-term US presidents tend to become more interested in foreign affairs over time, not less. Why? Because usually their domestic power diminishes. They lose control of Congress, usually in the midterms. And where do they have maximum prowess and power? Well, of course, it is on foreign policy, where they haven't got the checks and balances that they do at home to nearly the same extent. So we could find Trump become more interested in foreign affairs over the next 4 years, not less. And his power unchecked, not checked. What do you think? Which option would you go for? 1, 2, or 3? Who should we cling to? What should Britain do and navigate this Trumpian world? 0345 6060 973 0345 6060 973 is the answer. Getting close again to the EU. You're listening to Lewis Goodall here, sitting in for James O'Brien here on LBC. The time is 11:17.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Time is 11:19. Let's talk to Neil in Nottingham, who I think has got something to say about how Britain should act in this new world. Neil.
Morning, Lewis.
Morning.
I think he should go for option 4.
Okay, what's option 4? Let's add it to the list.
The
Neil stratagem.
My Neil stratagem. Option 4 is, first of all, to take a very long, hard strategic look at the world geopolitics as they now are. Not as we think they might be, but the whole reality across the piece. Secondly, he needs to adopt something that Trump would respect, which is, if you like, what's best for Britain, but not just talking about it. And thirdly, Starmer needs to really recognise as an opportunity, I think, for some high-level world leadership here. So in other words, we don't go begging to the EU or Trump to somehow help us grow our economy. We think much more strategically about what's best for Britain, and we fall back on our unique traits, which are the quality of our thoughts, the quality of our governance, and being able to be rational. So there's a lot we can do still to grow our own economy internally without having to go with the begging bowl to Europe or Trump.
But let me ask you, Neil, so on a very practical level, let's just say, for example, that Trump makes good on his threats and uses some form of political, economic, even military pressure against Greenland and Denmark to try and get what he wants on Greenland. Now, in that situation, which is clearly a binary, where do we sit? Where do we fall? Because it's not clear to me how option 4 kind of where it gets us.
Well, the problem with option 4, sorry, not with option 4, the problem with the other options is that Europe is in a weak position through lack of good leadership. So in other words, we ought to be going to Europe to try and maybe offer something along those lines, recognising the reality of Europe, because that's the problem. It's all very well talking about it as a trading bloc, which it is, and that's one level. But as an organised bloc, it's probably in a worse position than it's been for a long time. You know, it can't defend itself. It's got chopping and changing leadership. It's got lots of internal pressures. But what Europe needs is some strong leadership. And we could be in a position to at least recognise the reality of that and argue our case from that sort of position rather than
it's hard for us to lead. It's hard for us to lead it outside the EU, isn't it?
Well, maybe, but maybe that's part of the world order, looking ahead a bit more and thinking about what Europe is and how it could work. And I'm not talking now simplistically about joining and all the rest of it. I'm talking about the reality. I mean, if you look at Trump, what you've got to separate out are the two strands, as you were saying, to the situation. One is the politics. So, in other words, you could have the current situation, but they were decisions made by a rational government of, let's say, the old US school. But on top of everything, you've got to put in there Trump's malignant narcissism. And I'm not saying that just as an insult. I'm saying that as a diagnosed clinical condition. And if you look at the traits of that, you see it running rampant through everything he does. So as you've said, even if you were to kowtow to him tomorrow and flatter him so that tomorrow you were his best mate and a great guy and all the rest of it, and he gave you a deal, what's to stop him ripping it up the day afterwards? I mean, you just have to look at his whole tenure. One day people are the best people in the world, the next day they're terrible. One day he strikes the best deal in the world, the next day it's forgotten about. He's not bound, like Boris wasn't, albeit on a lesser level, by any notions of integrity, trust, consistency, and even truth. I mean, he creates his own reality. So are we going to go to him cap in hand? I mean, obviously Keir Starmer can't say all this, but in terms of his strategy, to tie your boat, if you like, to Trump's raft would be a complete and utter nonsense. We need to think about what's best for us. Why not? We should be talking quietly, for instance, to Canada behind the scenes. We should be talking to Europe behind the scenes about how we could collectively respond to this, not through Twitter and all the rest of it and the rest of the nonsense, but some high quality judgment, strategic analysis and leadership. And Keir Starmer is actually in a position, if he could see it, maybe to actually start to play that role.
Neil, grateful to you. Option 4 there, the Neil stratagem. Peter, maybe he's got an option 5. Peter in Richmond. Peter, morning.
Oh, yeah. Hi, Lewis. Yeah, I've got option 5.
Okay, great. Well, we've got a good list here. We should send this to the FCO by the end of the day. They need some help.
I was taken earlier on with the expression "buy anything but American," and what I'd like to do is to
Baba.
Barbara. I'd like to take the pressure off of politicians and hand it over to consumers of the world. We could create a commons where we collectively decide to do that. And the good thing about consumers is there are no borders. Politicians won't know who we are, including Trump. And just by stealth, we can stop traveling to America. We can stop buying certain American goods. Certainly Tesla, certainly X, maybe Kellogg's, maybe maybe other, Starbucks, other consumer goods. And that by virtue of that, he won't identify.
Think Trump would care? Think Trump would even notice, Peter? I don't think he'd even notice, would he?
Well, I think if you were able to actually invigorate that kind of collectivism, because I'm behind it. I read about it happening already in Canada today, and I was excited where a guy said that he just cancelled his holiday to the States. If we all start doing that and we tear up our Virgin Fly Drive, I think it could be very exciting. You walk past Starbucks, you go to the independent coffee shop.
But Peter, then what's the option there? I mean, but then we'll be buying, but we'd still be buying from China, would still be buying from other countries around the world, which are, America is still a democracy at least, so surely it would be better to buy from the United States than China, where most of our stuff actually comes from.
Well, yeah, and obviously, American trainers are mostly made in China, so there's a whole supply chain to debate. But I think that generally that just to start thinking local, and if by, in the supermarket, you just walk along the shelves and you buy in a certain way, is an incredible power. And all I'm trying to say is I think that consumers have the power, and it would take the pressure off of politicians. After seeing Mandelson last week kiss the ring, it was pitiful to hear what he said, and they're all having to do it. It's between a rock and a hard place. I think we need to just take the pressure off the politicians and hand it over to the consumers. That's all I'm trying to say.
All right, Peter in Richmond there with option 5. Let's hand it to the consumer. I'm not entirely convinced that people power is going to be the thing that convinces Donald Trump one way or the other. Of course, if Trump were to impose lots of tariffs on all sorts of goods, that itself will have an effect. Of course, we are one of the few. The reason that we might be spared any of the tariffs is not so much because of Trump's affection for the UK, although I think that does exist to some extent, largely because of his late mother. But also, of course, that we have a trade deficit with the United States, one of the few countries to actually do so. So in one sense, you could say that he would just be harming himself and his own country. But he's doing that anyway. He's doing that anyway. So I don't think that is any guarantee whatsoever of anything, because frankly, very often Trump doesn't really necessarily even understand some of the most basic economic precepts at hand. He insists, for example, on tariffs, that it isn't American businesses and consumers that pay them, but the country involved, much in the same way that it would be Mexico that paid for the war. Of course, complete and utter nonsense. Let's talk to Barbara, who is in Havant down in Hampshire. Barbara.
Oh, good morning.
Good morning.
I just wanted to make a general point, is that this tariff issue is interesting in that it highlights the delusion of sovereignty that this country has. It was originally weakened, or very recently weakened, by the bond markets, which actually tell us what we can and can't do. And now we've got President Trump, who might decide our fate. What do we do about it? Well, I think we're in a particularly difficult position. We don't belong to the EU. We no longer belong a member of the EU, so we are in a very weak position. I would feel sick if we had to go, as so many politicians are going, cap in hand to Trump, denying what they said a year ago about him and suddenly pretending like he's God's gift to democracy and the world. It's nauseating. It's a further sort of chip into the trust we have in our politicians of all hues. So, and I think I don't think this is going to be the case of the UK, that we're going to turn towards China, but I think it's definitely going to be the case for lots of other countries who aren't so hawkish with regards to China. That's probably where they will go. I don't know the answer. Starmer's going to have to be super clever. Perhaps he is that sort of person. Perhaps he is analytical, and as we saw in the lead up to the election, quite able to just sit and see how things go. But I think it's way beyond his and the government's control. I don't know what's going to happen. It's quite unbelievable.
Where would your heart be, Barbara, in terms of...
My heart would be in doing something, aligning ourselves with the EU, because especially with regards to Greenland, Denmark, NATO, etc. I think that would be strong, and the fact that they tend to keep to their agreements.
Yes.
We could do a deal with Trump today, and 3 weeks down the line he might think, that doesn't serve my purposes. And, we do wonder what his purposes are. If he doesn't realise that what he's doing is inflationary, and probably not offset by loads of companies setting up in America, so surely his advisors realise this. They can't. It would be foolish and complacent of us to think that they were all so dumb. They must have another plan, which has got nothing to do with American nationalism, which has got everything to do with supra nationalism of the major corporates. And those are the people that he's really aligned to, or at least they're half of his constituency. And he's going to disappoint the other half, the MAGA faithful, because the last thing they want to see is the price of their eggs going up, and that is what they will see.
The thing is, though, Barbara, it's interesting, isn't it, the question about whether he pays a political price, because you can again draw another comparison to Brexit here, which is that you can say, look, there was lots of economic damage from Brexit, but it's not as if the people who were responsible for Brexit have necessarily paid a particularly significant political price for it, in the sense that very often they'll just say, well, that's as a result of something else, or they'll try and align it with something else. Even when negative predictions of economic doom come true, it's interesting that the blame and culpability does not always land where you think it might.
No, because we know where it lands. It lands on immigration and asylum seekers. That's the strategy. It never lands where it should land, on the people who have, despite all the economic downturns for average working people of Brexit, some people have made a hell of a lot of money out of it. And in order to distract our attention from them and the increase in inequality in our country, we're always talking about 100,000 asylum seekers.
Yeah.
And migrants, for the most part, who are paying taxes and without whom the country couldn't actually function. So it's such a mess. It's so awful, so dispiriting. I don't know what to say. I'm going into my garden.
Well, good luck to you. Cold out there, Barbara in Havant. Thanks so much to you. We're going to continue this conversation about where Britain should be and where we should position ourselves. Keir Starmer off to Brussels today. First EU Council meeting for a British Prime Minister since Brexit. Actually meeting in the very palace, the very building that Ted Heath signed our accession into the EEC back in 1972. Should we be getting closer to the EU in response to Trump reshaping the World Economic Order with the biggest single round of protectionism that we've seen since the 1920s? We all know what happened next. 0345 60 60973, 0345 60 60973. First, though, at 11:32, let's get the very latest LBC News headlines with Thomas Watts.
James O'Brien on LBC.
So find me on Twitter and Blue Sky in particular. Much easier to find stuff on Blue Sky because the Blue Sky these days, because of course it is not a sewer. Just search for Lewis Goodall on the app and I can see your comments as they come in. Can see a few people here. A lot of love out there for Barbara, our last caller here. There, Jacqueline saying here to the last caller. Someone else saying Barbara, yes, covered the broader tariff issues absolutely perfectly. Callie said what Barbara said, couldn't put it better. Callie from Gosport. So Barbara, if you haven't disappeared into the rhododendrons in your garden by now, then you're getting a lot of love on the phones and on the text. Just in terms of where we're sort of going, what the kind of day looks like. And you've kind of got to do this more and more now. I mean, US politics geek like me always did it to some extent, but there is just such a fusion between US, UK news. Right now, it's as if the kind of whole world news river kind of flows directly through Washington, D.C. There's going to be emergency talks later today between Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum. This all, of course, following this. And again, I mean, a few people saying, oh, is it going to make that big a difference? These 25% tariffs that Trump is imposing and saying that he's going to do on the EU as well. Bear in mind, these tariffs come in instantly for Canada and Mexico. They're coming into effect at American time, midnight tonight. Manufacturers across the US will have massive commodity price increases, raw material price increases overnight. No sign whatsoever of the president breaking down. As I say, Bloomberg has described it. Don't take it from me. Experts, Bloomberg, financial newspaper, financial website, has said it is the most extensive act of protectionism since the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930. The Smoot-Hawley tariffs, any GCSE history student out there will be able to tell you, absolutely central to the creation of the Great Depression a few years later. That is what we're looking at here. We're not talking about a bit of a tinkering around the edges as we saw in Trump 1. This is the biggest move towards protectionism from what remains the world's biggest economy. So we've already seen the impact on that in terms of European markets and in Asian markets as well. Keep an eye out. We'll be keeping an eye out what happens to US stock markets when they are open at 9:30 American time, 2:30 UK time. Really, really big indicator. Dollar strengthened, but global stocks around the world really shaking as a result of this, and all completely needless. Will Trump concede? Well, he has put out, inevitably on Truth Social, he said, will there be some pain? All of this in block capitals, of course. Will there be some pain? Yes, maybe, but maybe not. But we will make America great again, and it will all be worth that price that must be paid. Except, of course, it won't be Trump. It won't be Mr. President. It won't be you paying it, will it? It'll be your own voters, and indeed economic stability around the world to boot, which makes the West weaker, which makes autocracies stronger. Hurrah! 2 weeks in. Where will we be after 2 months or 2 years? What should Keir Starmer do in terms of navigating this extremely difficult geopolitical situation in which the UK finds itself potentially without close friends or allies, as we might have been, certainly without a club to which we are a member? Let's talk to James, who's in High Wycombe. James, morning.
Hi, Lewis. I love Barbara too, but she mentioned about the price of eggs. Just worth noting to your listeners that the US runs £193 million trade surplus in eggs, so I think they'll be fine. If there's barriers to selling them elsewhere, they'll have a flood of them on their domestic market.
Although not so much at the moment with the US, of course, because they've got a terrible case of avian flu across the country, which is massively restricting US egg production.
Fantastic, Lewis. Yeah, true. There's avian flu, and I'm sure that's going to cause some problems with supply. But look, I think what I want to point out is it's very negative on the call today. But let's take first principles and be a bit objective about this. I don't like or dislike Trump. I see him quite neutrally. He's not my president. He's theirs. So how do we deal with him? Well, let's look at what he wants. Okay, he's looking to redress massive trade balance. Now, you say that what he's doing empowers autocracy, but actually that's not technically true when it comes to trade balances. If you run a massive trade balance deficit, you effectively need to top up your economy by bringing in foreign capital. Now, that leads to tons of money ending up in the pockets of countries that are not friends with the US, China and other countries. So he's trying to redress that balance. It's not fair of the Western world to expect the US economy to subsidise growth with its own debt and then have to pay with national debt down the line.
Except that, of course, America is the global reserve currency for which it derives enormous economic and political power. And as a result of having that status, and as a result of having it
from the Nazis,
and having as a result of that, they can obviate and avoid what any other country would be going through now if they did what the United States has done in recent years, which is basically run deficits which are absolutely sky high in order to be able to give American consumers and American voters what they want. So there are trade-offs with all of these things. And indeed, I hear what you're saying. And you may not have heard, or maybe you did. Trump, as I said, Trump has got a point, particularly with regards to some of the protectionism that we see with China, the illegal dumping that they do. China is no friend to free trade or the liberal free trade order. No way. But we're not talking about China here. We're talking about what it's doing to Canada, what it's doing to Mexico, what it's doing to Europe, and it's bullying indeed. Let's leave aside the economic question for a moment. Bullying for its own ends of allies, including Denmark, over something like Greenland.
He's absolutely behaving in my view, a way that's quite aggressive towards allies. And I actually think that the tactic here is to look aggressive to his enemies. Because if he's not started
by having a go at his mates,
then that's the process, right? But who's more likely to come to a deal with him? His allies, who we're in massive, international structures with. Of course, there's a deal to be done, and credibly
But a deal
speaking,
for what? What does he want?
correct.
It's not clear. The Canadians have been clear, and the Mexicans. It's not clear what he wants. Like, what's this in response? It's not clear what he wants from them.
I think he wants a goods trade balance. He wants these countries to be buying more US goods. That's pretty clear, isn't it?
But they buy enormous quantities of US goods, and the North American.
They run a massive trade deficit with Canada.
James, this is a deal that he signed with them. He's reneging on his own deal, and this is the point. He's not a reliable partner.
It, so he needs to improve it. Look, I'm not defending Trump here. I'm advocating the devil, but you talk about this through the perspective of Brexit. And I have to say, gosh, Lewis, you're even more partisan on this than James is, and that's saying something. Why would we want to join the EU in a battle with the US?
I haven't said that we should join the EU. I haven't said that we should.
Our view,
James, you're hearing something which does not exist. When did I say we should rejoin the EU? I didn't.
You've advocated moving closer to the EU, and it opens up people to say you've been very negative about what Brexit did. The reality is that our trade deficit with the EU is only increasing on the back of the fact that we do
business
more
investment
trade with the rest of the world.
Business
we do
investment.
more trade now with the rest of the world.
Business investment.
On the ONS
fact. Business investment is 20% down on what it was in 2015-16. The UK manufacturing economy is far weaker than it was in 2015-16. We've had a permanent reduction in the value of sterling to the tune of about 15 to 20% since 2015-16. Fact. The British labour market, British people no longer enjoy the right to work and travel without impediment as they did before 2015-16. I didn't say we should rejoin the EU, James. You're making something up. I didn't say that. But what I am saying is we should deal with the facts. Britain finds itself in a weaker geopolitical position now than it would have done had we stayed in the EU, at least insofar as we are not part of a big regulatory trade bloc which the world is now dominated by.
That's incorrect, because we're actually part of the CPTPP, and we're not part of the EU, which means we're not going to get...
And how much trade do we do? Remind me how much trade we do with that, James.
Oh, I see. So actually, trade deals don't encourage trade. Is that right, Lewis? So being in the EU didn't encourage trade with the EU? You can't
but it's not a trade deal with the EU, as you know. It was part of a customs union and a single market. A single market and a customs union, which is different with just a trade. Well, it's different with just a trade. Are you saying that? Are you saying that? So you're saying on top of it. So you're saying, James. You're saying, James, that what we have now is the same as we had when we were in the EU, the free trade agreement we have with the EU.
No, I didn't say that. I said that
you were making that exact
deal,
equivalence.
The political union wrapped around it. And your view is that the CPTPP won't be useful at all when actually...
No, I'm just saying that it is no substitute.
With the rest of the world.
I'm just saying that it is absolutely... I'm just saying that it is no substitute for the trade that we have with the EU. Anyway, James, can't let you hog the entire thing. Enjoyed the spirited discussion. Let's talk to Kieran, who's in Dublin. Kieran.
Hi, Lewis. How are you?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
Good.
Good.
Not too bad. Just
Your
calm
thoughts?
things down a little bit. So the Wall Street Journal called it the dumbest trade war ever. So it did.
Yeah.
And I'd just like to say, looking at the UK Gov figures that are currently the most up-to-date ones, there's 41% trade with the EU and 21% with the States. So we just say, for example, you're saying, which should you choose with? Should you go with the EU or should you go with the States? So here's a scenario for you. So we just say they put on 25% on EU goods, and we just say they put 10% on with the UK. Could the UK very well turn around and say to the EU, turn around to the UK and say, going forward, any products that you're sending into the EU now that have American parts in them are subject to a 25% tariff because we're being hammered on 25 and you're only getting 10?
Yes.
So would that make it even worse then? And then Trump goes away after 4 years. And then the EU are looking at you and going, right, well, exactly who are you with? You're jumping from one to the other to the other. Are you with us or are you not with us?
Yes. I mean, I suppose that's the problem is that it's the unpredictability, isn't it? The volatility.
Yeah, but I mean, all that came out after Brexit that people didn't realise, I know we're not going back to Brexit, that didn't realise what was going to actually happen when it did happen. It was like, it caught everyone by surprise. I was shocked. I was sorry he's left, of course, but caught everyone on the hop. Is this going to be the same thing now? So you say, okay, we side with the UK, or we side with the USA, and then your exports are hit even more within the EU.
Kieran, in Dublin, grateful to you. We're going to be talking in a minute about another element in the way that American leadership in the world is changing before our eyes. I'm not saying it pejoratively or positively or negatively, but it is certainly changing, and that is something I've already mentioned with regards to a story that I think is being underreported right now, which is the massive changes that Trump is bringing in to the way that America does international aid. We'll be talking about that in a minute. And after 12 o'clock as well, we're going to be talking a little bit, moving away from the fetid environment of international affairs and instead looking at the fetid environment that is our school system, and the fact that, as you will know, the Education Secretary today is announcing the whole series of changes to the way that schools are examined. I want to talk to you about whether or not you think that that is a good idea. We've, of course, changed the way that Ofsted does its work. They've now come forward with this proposed changes which involve different sort of colour systems rather than the simple, outstanding, good, satisfactory, requires improvement and so on. Do you think that is a good idea? Doing that after 12 o'clock. Lewis Goodall sitting in here for James O'Brien. The time is 11:47.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Time is 11:50. Going to return to this question, which, as I say, I think is not getting enough attention right now, which is the proposed changes that the US administration, the new Trump administration, is making in the way that America does international aid. America, one of the biggest international aid donors in the world, not necessarily because of a percentage of the money that it gives as a proportion of its economy, but because obviously it's the world's biggest economy. So just in sheer numbers terms, it's just maths, gives a lot of money, tens of billions of dollars. Trump has basically stopped nearly all US humanitarian aid. There are some exceptions. And it seems that Elon Musk, of course, in the guise of the DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, is making quite dramatic changes, even in the last 24 to 48 hours, including, it would appear, lots of US aid. That is the name of the program, the agency that delivers and distributes all of the aid, including actually freezing out many of its own employees from their own security clearances, their own offices, and so on. Now, humanitarian groups have warned that this could be absolutely catastrophic on a humanitarian basis around the world. Oxfam has said that dismantling US aid, which seems to be the direction of travel, would be a callous, destructive political power play that would have deadly consequences for millions of people living in dire humanitarian emergencies and extreme poverty. Amnesty International has also said that it would put the rights of millions of people around the world at greater risk as a result. And Senator Chris Murphy, who's a Democrat, has said that there are big questions for American foreign policy because it could end up decimating foreign aid for issues like feeding malnourished children, anti-terrorism programs, public health. The move also potentially, he says, bolstering China as foreign countries now stripped of US aid may turn to China for assistance and cut more deals with the country's government, giving Beijing more power. Well, let's turn to someone who really knows certainly this field and also the importance of, historically anyway, American power around the world. And that's Alistair Burt, former Conservative International Development Minister, Foreign Office Minister as well. Alistair, thanks so much for joining us this morning. Are you concerned by what we're seeing with the potential changes of US aid?
Yes, certainly. And I think your introduction covers it very well, Lewis. In terms of sheer scale, roughly, the United States contributes about a quarter of all the world's spending on humanitarian aid, whether it's through the UN or elsewhere. To take that chunk out of the various programs, and these range from emergency programs to long-term health programs in a number of countries where people need it, is absolutely devastating to the work being done on the ground. And as people in the States, say, the work may be charitable, but it's not charity. It's got a strategic importance. It means that people will turn to the West when they need help and assistance. If we're not there, they will turn to somebody else. So it won't help the United States long-term efforts to make sure it is seen as rather different to Russia and China, who focus on their own interests very much. So in a whole series of ways, it's a remarkable decision, and I think it's emblematic of what the Trump administration is seeking to do, both in the United States and around the world.
And it is particularly odd, isn't it, Alistair, because it's not just that Trump and Musk are saying, well, we want to save the money, we don't want to spend this money, and so on. It seems to have a whole different element to it as well, with Musk posting on X yesterday saying that it needed to die because, he said, without offering any evidence, he accused it of being a criminal organisation which was aiding terrorists and harbouring terrorists and so on. It is truly bizarre.
Yes, it is. The language the administration has used is sinister and deeply worrying. It's known that the president wants to go after his political enemies wherever he decides they might be. That's behind the new nominee to head up the FBI, for example, Kash Patel. Musk has said that he regards the USAID as a criminal organisation. It should be just shut down. And they're using their own judgments. There's no democratic element in this beyond the fact that, the president has obviously been elected. But in terms of democratic control over decisions that the executive made, they would seem to be rather lacking. It seems to be done on whim and on an ideology which is focused largely against anything which they deem to be contrary to American interests, whatever anyone else might think.
Do you think that it makes the case stronger for the UK, with other European allies potentially, but that the UK government should try and plug some of the gap? Obviously, financially, it won't be able to do all of it, but should perhaps try its best to plug some of the gaps that are left by US aid?
I think in financial terms, as you say, it's impossible to plug the gap. If the United States really does withdraw its funding from agencies such as the World Food Programme, the World Food and Agriculture Organization, World Health Organization, no one can step in and unplug that gap. Programs will just die. But if it makes the case for why you support countries in difficulty, why you want to save hundreds of millions of lives over a period of time in order to make a contribution to those countries' development, their ability to do more for themselves, their ability to take part in global affairs, and therefore assist in reducing the number of refugees and those who are leaving war-torn and disaster-torn areas, then, of course, the United Kingdom and the European Union will continue to play their part. This is short-sighted stuff from the United States, but we're only 2 weeks into this administration. We don't know what else is to come.
Do you think that, as a former Foreign Office Minister yourself, do you think that we can rely, the UK can rely on the US now as an international partner?
Well, the short answer to that question, Lewis, now is I don't know. I remember how shocked I was when Liz Truss was asked whether President Macron and France were a friend or a foe, and she rather coyly said she didn't know. I would have had no hesitation in answering that question, saying France and President Macron, of course, they're United Kingdom's friends and allies. And I would normally, under no circumstances, have any hesitation in regarding the United States as a friend and ally. I often said when I was a foreign minister under a Trump administration, between 17 and 19, that the United Kingdom and the United States could stand more or less anyone at the top, because the degree of links between the two states in terms of intelligence, security, military, as well as humanitarian activities and the things we do in common around the world are so deep, they won't be completely shattered, no matter who became prime minister or who was president of the United States. But I'm worried. I mean, this has been 2 weeks. President Trump has demonstrated himself to be malevolent in relation to those who opposed him. His criteria for his picks for senior offices are loyalty. The former head of the armed services in the United States, General McMalley, has had his security detail removed. So has Mike Pompeo, who could not have been a more staunch supporter of President Trump during his presidency. This is a vindictive and malevolent individual. And he's turning his attention to anyone and any state who he thinks is acting contrary to his whim. Look at Canada, for goodness sake, a staunch Commonwealth partner of us. So the short answer to the question is, I don't know now,
but that tells you something.
Of difficulty, if we could rely on the United States or what the United Kingdom might ask, or it might come with a price.
And just finally, Alistair, do you think that this all makes the case for a stronger relationship with the EU? Do you think that makes the case for that inescapable?
I don't regard it as an either-or situation. I think there is a strong reason for a United Kingdom close relationship with Europe anyway. And I would think that, having opposed Brexit and the like, I think a good relationship with Europe is essential. I think it slightly worries people the degree of isolation there may be. You don't want to be cast adrift in a world of alliances where people rely on each other if you suddenly find yourself short of those sort of alliances. But, in times of difficulty, friends rally round. I think the United Kingdom's efforts to work more closely with the European Union is a good thing and would be a good thing regardless of where the United States might be.
Alistair Burt there, former Conservative International Development Foreign Office Minister, describing what Trump is doing is malevolent. It does feel as if the world, certainly sort of traditional political elites, are really waking up to a new world order, both political and economic. Something tells me that we're going to return to President Trump and his doings or misdoings throughout the course of the rest of the week. But we're going to move on now and talk a little bit about matters close to home, specifically with regard to schools, a story that has gone under the radar a little bit, but probably shouldn't have, and that is the quite dramatic changes that Bridget Phillips, the Education Secretary, is making to English schools. Changes to academies, yes, the whole structure that has developed over the last 10 years, but also to Ofsted and the way that it assesses schools themselves.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Lewis Goodall sitting in for the great James O'Brien all this week here on LBC. Peter is text saying, I love listening, Lewis, to leftists whine. Horrible when it's just politically led, isn't it? Like with taxing schools or not zero. Not one voter asked for this, yet the left does things without any thought. Well, now the right's doing exactly the same. We'll make this world in our image now. I don't think you might be the bad guy, do you, Pete? I don't think that maybe... That doesn't sound sinister at all, does it? Oh, well, yeah, phone in, we can have a chat. We're going to move on, though, and not talk about Trump for a little while, because, as I say, I've got a feeling that we're going to be returning to him over the course of the week. We're going to turn to matters closer to home. And this announcement from Ofsted today about how they are going to replace and change the way that schools in England are assessed and how it is communicated to parents. Because for me, this is actually one of those Westminster stories that's gone under the radar a little bit, maybe not over the course of the last week or so. But Bridget Phillipson, as the Education Secretary, maybe not the most out there member of the Cabinet. Maybe you don't see her on the airwaves all the time. Maybe she's not put up for every media round like some. Wes Streeting, I'm looking at you. But she has nonetheless been extremely busy, and she has been quietly changing many of the assumptions and the ways that English schools policy, and I say English, and I'm not in Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland, I'm not doing that to be provocative. It is just a fact, of course, because education is a policy area which is devolved, so this does not apply to Scotland or to Wales or to Northern Ireland. But she has been quietly changing the way that English education and the assumptions underpinning the governance of English education have been done actually for quite a long time now. Certainly for the last 14 years of Conservative government, but arguably you can say that there has been a consensus on education which actually stretches all the way back perhaps to the sort of middle Blair period, with the start of the Academies programme under Tony Blair. David Miliband was the Standards Minister, and Andrew Adonis, who was a Schools Minister at that time. And basically you've seen an evolution of policy, rather than what you see across a lot of government policy, which is, different administrations come in, different prime ministers come in, different secretaries of state come in for different departments, and they chop and change on policies all over the place. Actually, education policy has been far more cumulative over the past decade or so, 2 decades, really. It moved towards more powers for schools, more academies, free schools under Michael Gove, more freedom from the national curriculum, more ability and control over the sorts of teachers they employ, whether they have teacher qualified status or not. When schools are failing, they are forced to become academies or free schools. Bridget Phillipson has quietly been changing quite a bit of that and the architecture of the English schools system. And part of that has also been something that she promised to do. Not all of that she promised to do, but something she promised to do as part of the manifesto, which was to change the way that schools in England are assessed. Obviously, this comes down to Ofsted. Again, that's been a big part of that consensus over many years. And you have Ofsted inspectors come along and they mark schools outstanding or good or requires improvement or whatever it happens to be. She said she wanted to end that, what she described as overly simplistic way of assessing schools, because she said it doesn't give teachers and teachers an adequate opportunity to represent themselves, and it doesn't give parents what they need. So Ofsted have gone away and come up with a different system of doing these things. New system would grade schools, nurseries and colleges in 8 individual areas on a 5-step scale, ranging from exemplary to causing concern, which is coincidentally exactly the grading system that the management at LBC use for shows here, alongside a separate evaluation of whether safeguarding standards would be met. Inspections currently look at 4 to 6 areas, including safeguarding on a 4-step scale, as I say, from outstanding to inadequate. Now, as you might imagine, teachers don't like this either, and have said that they don't particularly like this new idea. We're talking in a moment to Aggie Chamber, our political correspondent, about the politics of this and exactly how this might work. But I want to talk to you in this hour about whether you think that this is a very good idea, and whether you think you are nervous about the idea of changing a system which actually, dare we whisper it, one of the real bright spots, some would say, I'm not saying, but some might argue, one of the few bright spots of governance and policy in the Conservative period of office, really bright spots, was around education in England, which has generally done better than its competitors in Scotland or in Wales, which are obviously not run by the Conservatives. And that has largely come through a focus on standards, academies, all of these things. The question is, if it ain't broke, why are we trying to fix it? And is this, again, very simple? I mean, maybe it was too simple, too simplistic, but at least it was very clear for parents. Outstanding, good, etc., etc. That works, doesn't it? If it works, why are we trying to change it? 0345 6060 973, 0345 6060 973. I want to hear from teachers and head teachers in particular, and parents, about what you think about these proposed changes. But first, Aggie Chamber is in the studio with me. Not even a Sunday. Maybe it is Sunday, we just haven't gone to bed. Actually, it's very far away from the weekends. It's very far away from Sunday. It's quite depressing, isn't it? You don't look depressed, though. You look happy.
Not even remotely depressed. I've spent my morning listening to Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary.
Well, what could be brighter?
What could be brighter? A genuinely interesting policy-led speech that began with the Education Secretary talking about her own upbringing, her history.
Very working class background.
Very working class background. She talked about her dad wasn't really in the picture. It was her and her mum and her granddad who read to her a lot. When she was about to go to school, her mum was really worried about money, and a guy down the road, one of their neighbours who also didn't have loads of money, just put some money through the door on an envelope saying money for Bridget's coat. So she talks about the fact that not everyone went to kindness. There was a lot of crime, but she went to this brilliant school, and it was that brilliant school that gave her every opportunity, which brought her onto the changes that she is wanting to make. So yes, on Ofsted, that proposal is part of it too. But there's also, the Children's Wellbeing at Schools bill that's going through. She said she welcomed the criticism, which I will come on to in a moment. But also she unveiled £20 million of new funding and first expert teams to help what she called stuck schools, those rated inadequate or to require improvement in their past two Ofsted inspections. And then in terms of the Ofsted inspections, she's changing it to this kind of colour-coded, potentially more complicated 5-point scale. And we can just listen to a bit of her speech now.
Opportunity for every child, in every school, in every part of our country. Everything I do as Secretary of State, I do for all children. The ones who grew up on streets like mine, who don't not yet have a great school to go to, who are weighed down by their background. I am asking more of schools, of trusts, of parents, of Ofsted, of myself and of this government, and I make no apologies for that. We need change to turn the drift and delay of today into the restless progress of tomorrow. Because I believe that background shouldn't be destiny. I believe in the power of education to take us to a brighter future, and I believe that each and every child in our country deserves nothing less.
Now, the original Ofsted report cards were scrapped after Ruth Perry took her own life, which followed an Ofsted inspection. And her sister, Professor Julia Waters, has been extremely critical of that last system. And actually today, speaking to LBC, she was pretty critical of the new system.
I do not believe for 1 minute that this system that they have proposed will be greeted with enthusiasm by the teaching profession. It continues to be dangerous. It shows Ofsted are incapable. They may have been listening, they haven't been hearing.
And then we also had the General Secretary of the National Education Union saying the proposals outlined in today's consultation will make matters worse, not better. It will not deliver better information for parents or school leaders. So what did the Education Secretary make of all that? I asked her.
I do pay tribute to Professor Julia Waters for the work that she has taken up on behalf of Ruth and the whole family following the tragedy of Ruth's death. Of course, there is an important need to strike a balance to make sure that the well-being of staff, of teachers, is an important part of this. We make that very clear in our accountability reform document that we set out today. But I do think we can deliver a better system that provides a stronger inspectorate, but a clearer focus on what needs to change. But of course, this is only one part of the reform that's needed. Sir Martin is taking forward wider reform that is necessary and long overdue. The report cards are an important element of this, but not the only area where change is required in terms of Ofsted's work.
Now, I mentioned that her Children's and Wellbeing Schools Bill, which is currently progressing through Parliament, that will ensure that all schools follow the national curriculum, make them employ only qualified teachers or those working towards qualification, and introduce the same pay scales across all state schools. Now, that's been heavily criticised, not just by the Conservatives, but some Labour in Labour too. And notably, she mentioned Michael Gove, former Education Secretary, not once but twice during her speech, but he has been, pretty savage about her reforms, accusing her of trying to dismantle the Academy's programme brick by brick. Now, she's already had to clarify, she said, on the pay, that would be a floor rather than a ceiling. But there are big concerns about this. And there is some reporting in The Sun that several government sources in Number 10 have been left blindsided and angry at the scale of backlash to the plan and believe, they say, that Miss Phillipson could have handled it better.
It is interesting. There's an element of it that reminds me a little bit of it. I'm sure it won't unravel to the same extent. But it reminds me a bit of... in the early period of the coalition government, when you had Andrew Lansley, who decided to sort of make a lot of reforms to the NHS, it sort of caught actually Number 10 by surprise a little bit, and some of them didn't necessarily understand what they were doing. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily happened here to the same extent, but there is a sense, isn't there, that maybe, partly because of how Starmer responded to it when he was asked in a question in PMQs about it a couple of weeks ago, sense that maybe they've been surprised maybe by at least the reaction to some of this stuff.
I think that is what some of the reporting is definitely implying. And I think what is, I suppose, strange about the way Keir Starmer set up this government was because he was so focused on delivery. He basically kind of gave every Secretary of State kind of just, okay, you need to deliver this. In a way, don't really care how you get there, but we just need to raise standards. We need to deliver X. We need to deliver
Which some
Y.
people would say is good. It's allowing his Secretaries of State to get on with the job and so on.
Exactly. And I think there has been a bit of a shift over the last 6 months where I think a few people in Number 10 have thought, actually, maybe this isn't working. We need to kind of have these hands-on approaches. And apparently Number 10 now do kind of go to departments or speak to Secretary of States to kind of check on progress. So they're not surprised. So they're not blindsided. But I think, there has been surprise about some of the backlash. And, I kind of ran through it there. Fine, Michael Gove's criticising. Fine, Kemi Badenoch's criticising in PMQs. Not great when you have people in the unions. Not great when you have Ruth Perry's sister criticising. Not great, indeed, when you have those unions and indeed Labour MPs themselves criticising. So it'll be interesting to see where this goes. But the fact that Bridget Phillipson is already having to clarify some of those comments means that we might have to keep a very close eye on this.
Meanwhile, just briefly while we've got you, obviously we're talking in the first 2 hours about whether or not, or how Starmer is going to play these tariffs and Trump and so on. Still no word from Number 10 about a potential UK-US visit or a trip to Washington. Mr. Starmer goes to Washington.
Well, I can reveal that right now Natasha Clark is in the lobby briefing. So potentially she'll an exclusive, which starts at 11:30.
James O'Brien don't get those, does he?
Potentially when she comes out of that, she'll have an answer on whether or not that visit is going to happen this week, next week, or anytime soon.
There we are. You'll hear it here first, no doubt. Aggie Chamber, LBC political correspondent, has been at the Education Secretary's speech. She decided to really push the boat out this morning in terms of the venue, and she did it in Westminster. Want to hear from you about what you think about these proposed changes that the Education Secretary has been outlining. Is it actually really welcome? Maybe you're a teacher who thinks these, and I've spoken to teachers before about this, who think that Ofsted, it just does not work, or it did not work in the way that it has in the past. It just, was a system that was not fit for purpose. Maybe you're a head who thinks that, or maybe you're a parent who is worried about what this could mean for standards in schools. And of course, it is working class kids, as Bridget Phillipson herself would absolutely attest to and say, because it is her story. It is working class kids who very often need those standards the most. 0345 60 60 973, 0345 60 60 973. You're listening to Lewis Goodall here on LBC, sitting in for the great James O'Brien. The time is just coming up to 12:18.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Time is just approaching 12:20. Just keeping my eye on here, the live sentencing of Daniel Khalif. You might remember Mr. Khalif being sentenced for escaping from prison, spying for Iran, having fled from Wandsworth, or escaping from Wandsworth prison in September 2023 by clinging to the underside of a food delivery lorry, passing information to Iranian agents in exchange for cash. We'll bring you the results of that sentencing as soon as we have it. Just on this question around education, I think it is important. I'm really conflicted about this because, on the one hand, I think Bridget Phillipson, you can't have Bridget Phillipson's background and story and know that she can't be concerned and worried, and that her primary focus, I believe her when she says she wants working class kids like herself to do well. And that is my background and my story as well. So in that sense, have exactly the same concern. And it is because of that I do slightly worry that anything that impacts on school standards, and I'm not saying that this will, but anything that could impact on school standards when it has worked in the past, it might not be working now, is worrying, because that is the thing that working class kids need most. I remember at my school, which was a great school in some ways and not so in other ways, but a comprehensive school in Birmingham, I remember so vividly a deputy head coming in and saying, and this was this was a top grade class for a particular subject, and them saying, well, lads, with a bit of luck, you might get D's and C's. And that poverty of ambition was appalling. I mean, that was in the sort of early to mid 2000s. What kind of message was that? And I do think that the relentless focus on standards over the last 20 years under governments of different colours has been beneficial and has been helpful and has been useful. And the kids that benefit from that most are working class kids. The problem is that putting the resources in to match it has been problematic. And now we have a bigger gap between private school students and students who go to state schools in terms of funding than we've ever had before. And we wonder why we have big inequalities of outcomes, both educational attainment, but also in terms of career and earnings and so on. We wonder why. Well, because basically there are two educational worlds available. So I do worry about that, and I think both things can be true at once. Let's talk to John, who is in Chichester. I think used to be a teacher himself. John.
That's right, yeah. I came from a similar background. I was a working class kid in South London, had an appalling education in the 60s. I came back to education later on in life and fell in love with it and fell in love with teaching. Biggest problem that I've seen in almost 30 years of teaching, if you've got a student who's struggling, what do? You support them and you help them in whatever way they can. You don't beat them down. You don't take away anything. You just encourage them and you support them in any way you can. If you have a struggling teacher, you don't give them a report and say, right, you're on report, and you better shape up or get out. You mentor them. You take an experienced teacher and say, look, take this teacher on for a year and help them out. And that's exactly what schools need. If they're struggling, they don't need to be graded and judged. They need to be helped.
But doesn't, John, the act of grading, it does communicate something to teachers, to parents, doesn't it? It does help them know how different schools in their area are doing. And if a school does do badly in inspection, then measures can be taken to try and improve it.
That's fine, yeah. But the emphasis should be on something else other than this grading system. I think they appeal to a political base. We're keeping on top of this, and we're it's hard to put in a few minutes, but been watching this for years. I actually wrote to Bridget Phillipson a few months back.
Oh, really?
I'm an educational journalist now, and I wrote an open letter
What did you say to her?
In my column. And I said, we need mentoring in schools. We need teachers to be mentored, because the only way you're going to improve the quality of teaching, which improves the quality of schools, is for the people who really know what they're doing to take under their wing those people who are struggling with teaching. You don't threaten teachers with their job. You support them, and you do everything you can to do with individual students.
But shouldn't some teachers be threatened with their jobs? I mean, if they're not good enough.
No.
Never?
If after a year of mentoring, if you just refuse to listen to your mentor, then yeah, I would say, fine, you're not cut out for teaching.
Yeah, I mean, some people will just not be good enough,
sure.
right? So they should lose their job.
But I've met so few teachers who don't respond to good mentoring. Most of them, they're struggling because somebody's actually not shown them how to do it.
And what does mentoring look like?
It all comes from, you sit into a classroom, you go in not to inspect a teacher. As a mentor, this is what I do now. I'm a retired teacher, but I mentor new teachers. But I sit in their classroom as a friend, and I take them to one side after a lesson and say, I'm telling you this as a friend. You mustn't do that. Like, don't shout at students. If I saw a young teacher shouting at students, say, do not shout at the student. You don't know their story. Whatever you do, stop doing that. I'm not threatening you. I'm not threatening you with your job. I'm not going to threaten you with a disciplinary report. I'm just telling you, as a mentor, it never helps to shout at a student. Talk to them. And talk to them as human beings.
And John, have you seen the proposals for what will replace a single word assessments, this sort of colour scheme?
I haven't seen them in full, no.
But essentially it comes to this, lots of different sort of measurements and lots of different criteria, which are then sort of assessed on a sort of colour scheme rather than the sort of single word assessment. And what would you make of that in principle?
Well, it sounds to me from what you've said, it's just shuffling deck chairs. You go from words to colours.
Yeah, which are potentially just less clear.
It's not the same thing. Yeah, that's right. But again, if you want to solve the problems, and good schools that are doing good things, they don't need your help at all. So let's focus our time and limited resources on those schools that do need help and those teachers who need help.
But you would accept that inspection is important?
Well, yes, but not in a way that says, I'm going to find you out and I'm going to give you a poor grade.
Yeah.
But to find out what can I help you with.
Right.
I mean, that's what I do on every second micro, macro picture. What I do with individual teachers is I sit in their classroom as a friend. I said, I'm not writing any of this down. I'm not reporting you to anybody. I'm just trying to tell you, this is what works in teaching. Trust me, I've been doing it for 30 years. I've been highly successful as a teacher. I know what works and what doesn't. And what you're doing, or what you did there, was not good. So cut that out and change it for this more positive action. Because then teachers feel encouraged and supported and say, oh, okay, I didn't realise. I just got so frustrated. I said, well, okay, but you got frustrated, so go and apologise to that student when you get a chance and say, I didn't mean to shout at you. Let's start again.
Okay.
All
right.
It improves so much,
John.
because you're not being judged. You're being helped.
All right, John, grateful to you. Chris, I think, is a retired head teacher who is in Tower Hamlets. Chris.
Yeah, good morning.
Morning.
Lewis. Yes.
Morning. Afternoon.
I was a head teacher for 21 years in the same school in the East End of London. Tower Hamlets, as you probably remember, is just about the most successful education authority in the country. Had the
massive
poorest
turnaround.
children, poorest children, but highest levels of achievement.
Yeah.
So this is not, what I'm about to say to you now is nothing to do with wanting to lower achievement or not be ready to challenge underachievement. That's nonsense.
Yeah.
The important question that you and everybody else needs to be asking Bridget Phillips and Sir Martin Oliver, if you get the chance, is not, what's the difference, colour coding, words and phrases and all the rest of it, is how are the inspectors going to come to the conclusion about those judgments?
Yes.
I was around when Ofsted was first invented. I was in the same school. 1 week, 16 inspectors were in my school for 1 week. 16, Lewis. Do you know how many there were in an Ofsted inspection by the time I left?
Handful, isn't it? They've reduced them
Four.
considerably. Yeah. This is the thing. I remember
for a week. They were in for a day and a half, and they came to their judgments at lunchtime on the second day.
I remember this, Chris. Because I remember doing some reporting on this matter going into a school. I can't quite remember where it was. I think in the East Midlands somewhere. And I remember speaking to a head teacher, and at that time it was my own ignorance, and I should have known, but it stayed with me ever since. Because of course, if you yourself, when I was a kid in the kind of the primary school in the late 90s, and then the secondary school in the 2000s, and again one remembers, Ofsted, it was still in its relatively early-ish kind of period then, but it was a whole week. You have this experience, it's a whole week, and this whole team kind of ascend into, and it was to my surprise then that I learned that now these days it's barely a day.
They saw virtually every teacher in the school. They saw, multiple lessons. They attended meetings. They met parents. They met students.
Yeah.
They attended after
proper
school
comprehensive
events. On the gate at lunchtime and after school. They knew about the school when they came to their judgments at the end. That's the important. And following on from what your last caller was saying, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's really important, Lewis, to remember that the most successful country for years, and remains the case in Europe, is Finland.
Yeah.
Now, what did Finland do apart from abolishing private schools? They completely changed the way they made schools accountable. They were still wanting to raise standards, and by golly, they achieved it. But they abandoned their inspectorate, they abolished league tables, and they put all their money into collaboration, which is what your last speaker was talking about. Head teachers were told, your job is not to compete with local schools, it's to help them get better like you're getting better.
So what would you do with Ofsted then, Chris? If you were put in charge and politics were no object, you could do what you wanted, what would you do?
I'd take everybody to visit Finland.
Right, everyone's going to Helsinki with Chris. Chris in Tower Hamlets there. Grateful to him. I mean, look, I think that point around, which I do think it does get lost in this debate around Ofsted, I think is really important. In a sense, you can kind of call it, you can use colours, you can use numbers, you can use letters, you can use words, you could use Egyptian hieroglyphs if you want. Attach the Eye of Horus on there, see where you get to. But it doesn't really matter. In the sense that apart from maybe some things are slightly easier to understand for parents than others, what really matters, I suppose, if you're looking for a really good assessment, and I actually think that schools should be inspected robustly, but I think Chris is right. If you're going to do it, you've got to do it properly, and you've got to have an inspectorate that, what's the point in going somewhere for 1 day and seeing how they do, albeit that is, ironically enough, exactly the system we've moved to with kids themselves, where you just measure them on 1 day without any coursework and so on. But just one day with a few inspectors, is that really give you a proper comprehensive sort of state of the school? I wonder. Want your thoughts on all of this? 0345 6060973, 0345 6060973. Lewis Goodall, you will have noticed, not in fact James O'Brien, sitting in for him this week. We're going to be continuing this conversation and I did say, didn't I, won't we talking about President Trump for a while? Well, that lasted for about, 28 minutes? Because we're going to be checking in with Simon Marks in Washington on the latest in the various Trump fiasci? Who knows? Just after this. First, though, let's get the very latest LBC News headlines with Tim Humphrey.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Time is 12:35. We were talking, weren't we, with Alistair Burt, the former Foreign Office Minister, Conservative, about the changes to USAID, the agency which is responsible for the distribution of American aid throughout the world, and the very, very, very unusual role that Elon Musk is apparently taking at the heart of it, suggesting that it's a criminal organisation with absolutely no evidential basis whatsoever. CNN's reporting just in the last half an hour that the main office of the US Agency for International Development, USAID in Washington, was unexpectedly closed on Monday morning, and workers were emailed shortly after midnight saying they should not come in, according to multiple sources familiar with the matter. Chaos everywhere. We're talking about education. A few of your texts here. Someone says, please don't say my name. Our school currently has a head that is awful. The parents are absolutely desperate for our Ofsted to be able to put our concerns across, and I hope that something will be done. And so, fingers crossed, the report will highlight how bad the senior leadership team are, and for any new parents looking at the school will be aware. And we just heard about Finland, didn't we? We just had a text from Hannibal who says, says, I am Finnish. And talking of Finland, a big difference is that we have respect for teachers. Every teacher is educated to postgraduate level. They're trusted to plan what they teach to match the requirement of the national curriculum. They aren't micromanaged by Ofsted. Teachers are well paid and do not work 12-hour days. Trish is a teacher and is in Bognor Regis. Trish.
Oh, hello. Hi, Lewis.
Good morning. Good afternoon, I should say.
Yes, good afternoon.
Your thoughts on this, Trish?
Yes, I've been a teacher for 26 years, and it's the best job in the world.
That's nice to hear.
Oh, it's a really wonderful job, and we're privileged to do it. And I agree, it should be done robustly and properly, and we owe it to these children. But my experience of Ofsted in recent years has been, like other people were saying, they come in for a day, they have a look, they're just interested in data, really, which I know is important, but they don't seem to have any interest in the relationship.
So it's just a day, Trish. It is just like a day these days, pretty much.
It's literally a day and 2 days if you don't do well, but a day. And then they're not that interested in the relationship between the staff and the teachers, or in how the teachers are learning and growing as professional educators. And I believe very strongly, similar to John from Chichester, that the future is all about mentoring and coaching and self-development of our teachers, our children, and our schools. And I was hoping to see something like that in the new sort of proposals from Bridget Phillipson about schools being self-reflective and working out how they're going to improve, how they're going to develop and be the really best that they can be.
What do you think? What do you make of the Education Secretary so far, Trish?
To be honest, I haven't. We don't feel like we've heard very much from her. There was a letter from her at the beginning, which filled me with hope, and I thought, well, this looks really good, and she seems to understand. But as I say, I was hoping for something a little bit different in this new Ofsted proposal.
Trish there in Bognor Regis, lots from the teachers we're hearing from, perhaps not surprising, and not a lot of love for Ofsted as it has currently been, or as it has been constituted up to now. If maybe you've worked for Ofsted, or you've got something a bit more positive to say about it, 0345 6060973. Now, I did say, didn't I, having spent 2 hours of the slot this morning talking about Trump, that we would not be talking about him for the rest of the show. And yet here we are. Much like Trump himself, it is just a promise, I'm afraid, everybody, I cannot keep. Because we're going to be crossing now to Washington, to Simon Marks, LBC's Washington correspondent, of course. And we can do no other, can we, Simon? Because the president is remaking not only the political order at home, the economic order around the world, and yet again, more extraordinary antics with Elon Musk and what he and Trump are doing to USAID.
Yeah, absolutely, Lewis. I'm sorry to have forced you to break your promise.
As if.
But I think we're witnessing absolutely unprecedented events here in Washington, D.C. And it is important to draw attention to the nature of them. I got a text last night from a former senior administration official who described what had taken place over the weekend, a frenzy of activity, largely led by the entirely unelected Elon Musk, describing that frenzy of activity as a total revolutionary takeover. And as you were just saying a few minutes ago, we now know that essentially it is all over for USAID, the United States Agency of International Development, which is far and away the biggest player globally in the international humanitarian assistance and developmental game. So that is going to have knock-on effects not only for the thousands of employees who have basically been told to stay away from the Ronald Reagan building here in the heart of Washington today after it was raided by Elon Musk's Doge Brigade. That's the Department of Government Efficiency, which of course is not really an actual government department, but it's also going to have monumental knock-on impacts for USAID programs all over the world, whether it's, neonatal classes in Haiti or food assistance in parts of Africa or refugee assistance in Venezuela, scores and scores of programs that are now immediately, I think, going to come to a total standstill. What Musk did through his proxies, and his proxies, by the way, are all pals of his and business associates of his, again, entirely unelected, but seemingly authorized by President Donald Trump, was to show up at two separate government departments over the weekend, USAID, the Agency for International Development, and even more critically, the United States Treasury. At least in the case of USAID, they forced their way into the building. When security attempted to stop them from gaining access to the building, they threatened to call the U.S. Marshals to allow them to enter. In both departments, the Treasury and USAID, there were standoffs with employees, senior figures who were saying you cannot access these computer systems. In the case of the Treasury, the system that Musk and his team wanted to access was the payments system that handles billions and billions of dollars of US government payments. At USAID, they were some officials trying to protect systems that contained classified information. In both cases, those officials not only lost the argument, but they were all sent home on administrative leave. They were all immediately turfed out, essentially, of their positions. And Musk today controls the entire payments mechanism of the United States Treasury. Now, through that mechanism, has access to millions of Social Security numbers, has access to records of Americans who have received tax refunds, who have received assistance grants, and at USAID got his mitts on the computer system, shut down the website, terminated the email accounts of scores of employees, and has access to the classified information that those career employees were trying to defend. Musk and his team have been made officially Treasury employees as they start sifting through payment data, and literally on his own social media platform last night, publishing lists of recipients of Treasury grants that he says he is immediately cancelling, including a whole raft of them that were focused on assistance, including humanitarian assistance. And he's not stopping there. He took to X last night to declare the National Endowment for Democracy a scam. As with USAID, he has inferred that it is a criminal enterprise without any indication of any evidence to support that view. And I suspect at the National Endowment for Democracy's headquarters here in Washington, D.C., they are awaiting the Doge knock on the door. We have not seen anything like this in the modern era, and most extraordinary of all, from the Democrats, absolute crickets. Barely a statement being issued. Very late in the day, Democrats on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee put out a statement asking questions about what had taken place at the Treasury over the weekend. There is no leadership on the Democratic side. There is nothing being done here to enforce the traditional guardrails that in the first term stopped Donald Trump from doing anything that he wants, but now appear to be melting away in face of this onslaught by Elon Musk.
I mean, it is extraordinary, and you run out of superlatives, don't you, Simon? But there is there not a sense, even from behind the scenes, from Republicans on Capitol Hill, concern that Musk is amassing an astounding amount of power?
Well, I think there's definitely concern, but it was notable that not a single Republican signed on to the Democrat statement that was issued by their side on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee demanding answers to what had taken place over the weekend at the Treasury. They are frit. They don't want to put their head above the parapet and do anything to offend the boss. In this case, I think that's still President Donald Trump, although Elon Musk throughout this weekend has made us wonder. They all seem to be in lockstep still about putting even his most contentious nominees on into cabinet positions. I mean, I think the only one that might be in any difficulty is Tulsi Gabbard, his nominee to become Director of National Intelligence. But Kash Patel looks like he's going to waltz into office as the next director of the FBI. A Department of Justice employee got in touch with me over the weekend to ask me why the FBI had not yet arrested Elon Musk, given that it was plain to this Department of Justice employee that Elon Musk is breaking the law, that there are no laws that allow him to do many of the things that he did over the weekend. Well, the answer to that, of course, is that purges have already begun at the FBI, and that's before Kash Patel gets there. So the point that I'm making is that things are moving here very quickly because Musk worked the weekend to engage on what I think in other parts of the world would be described as state capture. You know, private business people, oligarchs taking the levers of power here in Washington, D.C. to benefit and aggrandize their own positions. Because of all of that speed that is being engaged by the Trump team, the system seems unable to keep pace. And I was looking back yesterday at the history of this phrase, state capture. And it was first used by the World Bank in the year 2000 to describe events that were taking place in the post-Soviet states, where powerful oligarchs were slowly co-opting their nation's resources and taking the steering wheel of government in those post-Soviet spaces. And the first report that the World Bank issued defining state capture was actually titled, "Seize the State, Seize the Day." And Elon Musk seized the weekend here. You know, Lewis, Washington's a Monday to Friday town. It's really actually now these days only a Tuesday to Thursday kind of town. Saturday and Sunday, those government offices are deserted. And he deliberately, and he said this on social media, he crowed about it. He deliberately picked this weekend to make his move, and it has left the city reeling.
Is there, do you think, Simon, do we think, I mean, we've got the astonishing prospect right now, haven't we? Let's just leave aside the American political element to it and the state capture that you've identified, which is mind-boggling. And my word, are they flooding the zone, to use that Steve Bannon term. But right now, the net result of all of this is that the world's richest man has gone into the offices of USAID over the course of the weekend. He's basically shut it down, which means that some of the world's poorest people will no longer receive some of the humanitarian assistance that they, perhaps life-saving assistance that they had been receiving before.
Yes, absolutely. And this is all part of the plan. I mean, it was on Inauguration Day that Donald Trump published an executive order about international assistance on the part of the United States. I'm just trying to find the text of it here. He declared that America's, and this is a quote, foreign aid industry and bureaucracy are not aligned with American interests and are in many cases antithetical to American values. Now, traditionally, foreign assistance And the fact that the United States, with I think $46 billion that USAID gets to spend, represents more than 40% of the entire world's humanitarian assistance budget, has actually been entirely emblematic of American values. But American values are being redefined by this president. Now, officially, we should say the official White House line is that USAID has simply been folded into the State Department, and that Secretary of State Marco Rubio is now leading a review of its programs to make sure that they align with Donald Trump's policy viewpoints. But Donald Trump has already told us in that executive order he thinks that foreign aid is basically antithetical to American values. So I don't think there's anybody sitting on the edge of their seats, biting their nails, wondering what Marco Rubio is going to conclude when that evaluation period is over. And look, if that evaluation period lasts 90 days, which is notionally what is supposed to take place, those humanitarian assistance programs in far-off parts of the world will have come to a complete standstill by then, because they can't operate without cash, they can't operate without supplies, and they can't operate without guidance and direction from USAID in Washington, D.C. So they have deliberately gutted this, and the chance of it emerging in any kind of fashion that looks like what it looked like before is, I think, negligible. There's also going to be a huge challenge here to foreign governments, including our own. I mean, on the morning in which the Prime Minister may well be celebrating the fact that Donald Trump last night indicated that perhaps he's going to be more lenient with the UK when it comes to tariffs than with the European Union, certainly seems to want to drive a wedge between the UK and the European Union in terms of leniency that he seems willing to offer the UK. I mean, the British government is going to find itself in the unenviable position of, on the one hand, needing Trump's largesse when it comes to reduced or perhaps even zero tariffs on trade, but on the other hand, having to sit there and answer questions about what the British government thinks about all the other frenzy of crazy that is taking place here. That's before we get to mass deportations. They withdrew the settlement visas for 600,000 Venezuelans over the weekend, 300,000 of them living in Florida, and those 600,000 people are now susceptible to deportation. They will definitely be targeted by the Immigration, Customs and Enforcement Division of the US government and trucked back to Venezuela, even though they had been told by the United States government, by the Biden administration, that their temporary settlement documents were all in order and for at least the moment they could stay. That's over 500,000 people from Venezuela alone that are now about to be rounded up. What's Britain going to say about that?
Simon Marks there, LBC's Washington correspondent, with a dizzying assessment. That's not because of Simon, but because of the extraordinary pace of events that is taking place in Washington. There is a transformation. It goes back to what I was saying before. There is a transformation of the American state, a transformation of the world economic order, and potentially the world political order unfolding second by second right now. It is hard to keep up. We'll do our best here on LBC, certainly on this show, throughout the course of the week. Lewis Goodall here on LBC. The time is 12:53.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Time is 11:55. I mean, some of the reporting that's coming out of American newspapers and so on about what's happening to US aid, and whatever you think about US aid, it is more the fact that, as Simon was saying there, Elon Musk, the world's richest man, clearly being given the command of huge swathes of the mechanisms and institutions of the American state. I can think of nothing quite like it. I can think of no comparison. Even when we talk about the Gilded Age and the robber barons and all that sort of stuff, these people weren't in the government usually. Very, very rarely. Maybe in the cabinet, maybe they'll be given one agency. Musk is basically being given free rein to do as he wants. It's astounding. It's gripping. It's chilling. Let's talk. Let's finish the show though with talking about what we've been talking about for this hour, which is schools and Ofsted. Elizabeth is in wonderful Ullapool in the Highlands. Elizabeth.
Hello. So I have been in a invidious position of being Ofsteding in primary or secondary. Which horror story would you like first?
Well, we've got 2 minutes for you, Elizabeth. So you take your pick.
Okay, primary school. I've been off for 8 weeks with an emergency appendix, hadn't seen my year fours for 8 weeks. went into my first day. Ofsted arrived, and I wanted to talk about what had happened to me and what had happened to them in those 8 weeks. Got criticised for Ofsted for not doing a lesson. Secondary school, I raised the standard in 5 years between under 50% A stars to C at GCSE level, all the way to 97, and even got 100% on my final year. And they came in one day, and it was the coursework being done. The deadline was due, 40% of the marks, and I got some feedback, and I was criticised because I wasn't allowing 2 people on the computer at once, even though the law states that they have to do their work independently. Right. And they were. When I told them about the results I'd got over 5 years, I kid you not, she sat there and she said, "Have you thought I can improve on 97%?" And I had 30% of my kids had English as an additional language.
Right. Wow, that is a real challenge.
You can't work with people who are in for a day, who come with an agenda. Can I just say, finally, though, the mentoring model, the Finnish model, superb. Worked, done it, been part of that, much, much better.
You were part of it, how?
Well, I have been in schools where they've kind of been part of the ethos.
Right, I see.
You know, as a mature teacher, when you sort of, get at a bit of a loss with things, or a new curriculum comes in or changes,
yes,
and somebody's prepared to come in and talk you through that.
Yes.
Brilliant.
Well, Elizabeth, you're definitely speaking on behalf of many teachers, I think we can tell from the course of the show today. This is a focus on mentoring. As I say, I think it's a question that is going to re-emerge and reassess. I think the politics around what is happening at the Department for Education right now is going to become a live one in British politics, more and more so over the coming weeks. But that is it from us for this show anyway. If you missed any of today's show, you can, of course, listen back on Catch Up on Global Play. You can pause, rewind live radio, listen to a range of podcasts, including, of course, which one am I going to say? You'll be amazed to hear. Yes, of course, the news agents will also be carrying on with James O'Brien daily while James is away. The best bits of this show in 60 minutes every day. Download for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it is the good Tom Swarbrick, but now, of course, it is the always outstanding to use those Ofsted ratings, Sheila Fogarty.
James O'Brien on LBC.